Welcome. Hopefully folks can hear me. You got these slides working for me? All right. Welcome everyone. I know folks are still settling in. I'd ask you if you could get to your seats. We're going to try really hard to stay on schedule. My name is David Ross. I am privileged to be the Executive Director of the Mental Health and Recovery Board here in Ashland County. So first, let me get through a few thank yous. There's a lot of folks to thank every year when we do this conference, which some of you, I look around the room, some of you have been here for all 16 of these. So I appreciate all of you that have come out today and over the years for the Pat Risser RSVP conference. You know, the conference was a couple of the folks, key folks here in the audience that were a part of it. Pat's widow Trish, as well as my former mentor Steve Stoner in the room. Say hi to them, but I would draw your attention in your packet. There's in the catalog, we have a nice little history of the conference. If you're not familiar with that, maybe take some time throughout the day to read a little bit about the RSVP conference, how it was formed and why it was formed. I think both of those things are very important. Most of you know we try to bring in speakers and discuss things that you can't find readily throughout the state or even nationally sometimes. And our lineup this year is really exciting, and I think you'll feel that as we go out throughout the day. Thank you to our speakers today. Wonderful folks. I'm going to talk a little bit, obviously, about Brooke before I turn it over to her for our morning keynote. I also have to thank my team. A lot of folks don't know how many staff we have at the Mental Health and Recovery Board. There's myself and 3 other people. Dr. Ashley, Sandy, and then Patty. They're all in the room here. So thank you to those 3. They keep my anxiety level manageable for these kinds of events because they do such a wonderful job of organizing these things, and they just ask me to do the bare minimum, which I appreciate. Also want to thank the Mental Health and Recovery Board, many Mental Health and Recovery Board members here at the conference. They were helping out in a variety of ways, including checking you in. Mr. Gauze was out there. Everybody knows Mr. Gauze in town, getting folks registered. Thank you to the board members for having the courage over the years to continue to fund this conference, to support it and promote it. They took a risk way back when, and they've continued to take a risk because, again, some of the topics that we address at RSVP aren't the things that are most popular or sometimes cut across the popular, and they're fine with that, and I appreciate them. There was a planning committee, an RSVP planning committee that put this together. We started months ago. These things just don't happen. There's a lot of planning and discussion involved, so thank you to the RSVP planning committee for being part of that. Also, our contract partners, they all have tables, which we'll get to that when I go through the packet. Hopefully you'll be able to visit. We built in time intentionally this year so folks could take advantage of what our contract partners are saying at their tables and providing. So again, Appleseed Catholic Charities and Acada, Jerry, Cheryl, and Rick, we just appreciate that relationship. These are all long-standing relationships between the board and our contract partners. Thank you for being part of this. Some years, some of you even present, and we appreciate that as well, but you're always supportive of the conference with your staff and giving them the time to come. Last but not least, I always like to thank Ashland University for hosting. And, you know, I've told you about the soup. I'm a little nervous because Brooke's a chef, you know, so she might judge the soup. I like it really well, so we have it every year, but we'll have a great lunch later on. Thank you to AU, though, for all their hospitality. They got new carpet this year. It's still a little busy for me, Dr. McElfresh, but I'm getting used to it. It is new, so that's nice. Let me review your packet information really quick. I want folks to be oriented for the rest of the day. There's a lot of great stuff in here. The conference schedule is in your catalog, so that's a key document. It talks to you about what's going to happen when, but it gives you a nice little bio of all our speakers for today. It also discusses, in particular, a little bit bit of a handout. It's like a half slip that talks about the session that Dee Barbish is going to do this afternoon. That's a very interactive session. All that you need for that is in your packet. You've got a tablet, you've got a blindfold, and Dee will explain all that to you. So I just want you to don't discard anything in your packet. You're going to need that as the day goes on. There's also some things in here for some coloring. Some of our folks like to doodle at the RSVP conference. And if you recall, last year we did art and music therapy. So we really brought out why that is so important and how it can be very beneficial. There's an evaluation in there as well. I hope that throughout the day, if you could stay the entire time, which is preferable, that you turn that in where you registered and let us know how we did, what you liked, what you think we can do better on. We sit down as a planning committee. We always go over those. We take those to heart. So when folks say things, the only thing we don't listen to is if you talk about the temperature of the room, you can put that down. We just won't pay any attention to that because you can never please everybody with the temperature. But we will listen to everything else, promise. So let us know how we're doing in all aspects. With that, did I miss anything else, Dr. Ashley, in the packet? Anything else important? Just yell at me. All right, if you say so. Let me try this. Okay, so let me start by saying, one of the more important things that I'm charged with doing is trying to figure out who's going to keynotes are going to be for the RSVP conference. I usually start this a year or so in advance, scouring all the things I read, the blogs, the Substacks, you name it. I'm always looking for folks both in Ohio and outside that I think are saying something that aligns with the mission and vision and values of our board, our community, but I think are going to help move the system of care, the community behavioral health system of care in the right direction. And when I first ran across what Brooke was saying, I was just struck by the fact that nobody else was saying what she was saying and nobody else was saying it the way she was saying it. And when I was doing my research, I came across this photo and in this quote, which, forgive me, let me read that. Antidepressant withdrawal has knocked my body into hypersensitive overdrive, and I could barely stand the feeling of clothes against my skin. The heat in the bakery made it worse, and the only thing I could do was sit in the freezer to find a touch of relief. But you can see it in my eyes, and I was done. And that's what I saw. When I saw this picture, I hadn't even read her book at this point. I saw this picture, and I said, I want to know more about the story behind those eyes. I want to know more about how she went through the withdrawal experience. And I was intrigued. So I was almost sold, almost Brooke, just with this photo. But then I came across this and I said, oh my. So I ran across an interview that was done by Brooke and her mom, Dee, where the two of them talked about both when Brooke started on medication as a 15-year-old and then how that had gone for her since she made the decision to come off those medications. And they just talked about the relationship. Because again, I think moms and dads have very unique perspectives when they make the decision for one of their children to go on psychiatric medications. Remember, they're making a decision based on the information that they're receiving from medical professionals or other specialists or prescribers. They're trying to do the best they can by their children. And if some of those ramifications over time end up differently than what they thought or were told, how do adult children then negotiate with their parents? I've seen it on the other end where there's a lot of animosity, where relationships are fractured and strained and there's a lot of blame. I've seen that side of it. But I think what you're going to hear today, after Brooke does her opening keynote and when she and her mom, Dee, talk about that, I think you'll see why I was sold at this point. I said I had to immediately reach out to Brooke and Dee to see if I couldn't convince them to come from Reno, yes, Reno, to the great county of Ashland and to speak to our group, not only about medication withdrawal coming off psychiatric medications, but also that relationship between, I think, parents and their children, particularly when the children maybe started the medications as a minor, and just all those complexities and how a relationship can move forward in, I think, a positive way. So yeah, you had me with those two, and I was just grateful that they were kind enough to say yes to Ashlyn in the RSVP conference. So with that, Brooke, because she loves it when I go on and on talking about her bio, let me read the official intro, and I will invite Brooke up on to the podium to speak to you all. And again, we'll try to follow the schedule you have as best we can, but please be gracious if we run a little bit over. But we also recognize we've got a lot of folks joining us over Zoom as well. So Brooke Seam was among the first generation of teens to be medicated with antidepressants. After spending half her life and her entire adult life on a cocktail of 6 drugs, she wondered, and again, this is the question for some of you that might be in a similar position, or people you know might be in a similar position, who might I be without them? Who might I be without them? Unfurled against a global backdrop and her work as an award-winning chef and Food Network Chop Champion in 2017, Brooke's story, again, we have the books for sale. Brooke will be signing those books later on. Brooke's story chronicles explosive and terrifying antidepressant withdrawal and the fight to manage the modern mental health system, all while demanding hope and forgiveness in the name of healing. Her work on antidepressant withdrawal has appeared in the Washington Post, New York Times, Washington Examiner, Psychology Today, and more. She is blogging, posting, vociferously. I read her stuff as much as I can. She's just saying so many wonderful things right now. Her book, May Cause Side Effects, won the 2023 Biba Prize for Memoir and has been featured in outlets around the globe. Please join me in welcoming to the podium, Brooke Seam.
Hello, everyone. Hi. No tech problems. Amazing. That's a first.
Give it time. Give it time.
We've got all day. Hi, it's great to be here. This is my second time in Ohio, but my first time in rural Ohio. I took a little drive through town last night. I really enjoyed it. I love small town America, and this place just delighted me. So thank you so much for having me. I'm going to give a little overview on how today is going to go, just because I want you guys to understand why I'm going to talk to you about what I'm going to talk to you about and how it's going to progress. So David gave a little background about my story, and I'm happy to answer any questions at any point today if I don't get to your question. But I'm going to be talking about antidepressant withdrawal specifically, how to identify it, what it is, and it's going to get a little technical at points. And I realize that not everybody in here is a clinician, but the reason why I'm going to get technical and nitty-gritty is because I think it's going to serve a really strong foundation for what's going to come later, which is going to be the conversation with my mom and my mom's work. And so I think you're going to get an overview of both the science, as far as we know whatever the science is on this right now, it's still a pretty new field, and you'll get a pretty technical understanding, which will then inform everything else as we go through. But before we start, and I start with this, I would love to get a little poll of the room because I'm curious about who all is in here today. So I know we have some law enforcement, so I'm gonna start with that because you guys are in a uniform and that's very helpful for me. So, so if you're law enforcement, can you raise your hands? Awesome. All right, if you work in a school of some way, if you are a school counselor, teacher, but you're working with kids in the mental health field, can you raise your hand? Excellent. Okay, if you're a practicing psychologist or therapist, but not an MD or prescribing clinician, can you raise your hand? Excellent. If you are a prescribing clinician of any kind, whether or not that's a PA or MD, can you raise your hand? No doctors in here today. Fascinating. Okay. Any pharmacists? No? Okay. If you are just a community member who's curious about this, can you raise your hand? Awesome. And if you're a parent, can you raise your hand? Wonderful. Okay. Thank you. Okay, so my name is Brooksime, and I am not a doctor either, so I'm glad there's none of us in this room today in some ways. And so you might be wondering why the non-doctor is standing in Ohio to talk about antidepressant withdrawal. I am a chef by trade, professional chef, and that's who I was and what I did for my whole career. I was living in New York City, working in fancy restaurants. I owned a bakery. And when I turned 30, I calculated the day of my own death. And I did this by taking about a dozen life expectancy tests, sourced from insurance websites and actuary tables and organizations. And then I averaged the results, figured in leap years, and scheduled the whole thing on my Google Calendar on November 6, 2069. This was a Wednesday, and I just wrote dead in big letters. It's 12 p.m., it's still there. I calculated that I had 30,595 days to live total. And at the time I did this calculation, I had 19,673 days to go. Now, the reason why I did this was because I had been put on antidepressants, a cocktail of antidepressants, when I was 15, after my father had suddenly passed away. And when I turned 30, I got to this tipping point where I realized that I was about to spend more than half my life medicated. And that also meant that I was about to spend more than half my life without my father. And that felt like a very interesting line to cross. And I was objectively not doing well. I wouldn't say I was in a crisis as far as suicidality, but I constantly thought about dying and I did not want to be alive. And that not crisis angle, I think, is really interesting because this was something that crept up on me in a very insidious way. Nobody would have known that this is how I was thinking or really what I wanted, but it was so slow. It was something I had felt for so long that I didn't have any indication that this was even dangerous or something worth talking about. So when I hear people talk about calling the suicide hotline, I can tell you that that never once entered my mind. This was something that felt so native to me that I didn't think that anything was going wrong. But when I hit this line and I realized I was about to spend half my life on these powerful drugs and my entire adult life, that started to bother me because it dawned on me that maybe if my antidepressants were working, I wouldn't be thinking about this. And that was the first time that this had dawned on me in the 15 years I had been taking them. That set off a cascade of just quiet thoughts. And then at the same time, I got this unbelievable opportunity to travel around the world for a year. And I realized that given the places we were going, which was not London and Paris, it was going to be the middle of nowhere, Cambodia and Malaysia and Croatia in wintertime, which was rough. But I realized that I was not going to be able to take a suitcase full of the 6 drugs I was on by that point with me. So I saw a psychiatrist, told her what the situation was, and she said, well, after I had to talk her into it, she said she didn't support me getting off the drugs at all, but I basically said, like, we got to do something here. I'm not doing well. Maybe there's a different drug. So we decided to find my baseline, and she just said, stop taking your Effexor XR cold turkey. I was on 37.5 milligrams of the dose at the time, which is the lowest dose on the market. So from her perspective, she couldn't take me off any other way. She couldn't prescribe me a lower dose. We couldn't cut a pill in half. This was a capsule. And according to her training, I just needed to stop. And that decision changed my entire life. Ultimately, I wrote a book about that experience, and that's why I'm here today. So we are going to start there and just keep that photo you saw earlier. That was of me about 6 months into the Effexor and Wellbutrin withdrawal. So keep that in mind. But let's get going. All right, so again, the context here is I was medicated as a kid. I was medicated at 15. I'd spent 15 years on the drugs. I was developing, went through puberty, all the brain changes and maturity that happens. And then we hit 30 and I hit withdrawal. So, all right. So withdrawal is a process of, I mean, we've all heard of alcohol withdrawal or maybe heroin withdrawal, right? It's when we have something in our body for a long time and we pull it out and the body doesn't like it. Now with antidepressant withdrawal, this is something that hasn't been particularly common in the in the zeitgeist or the lexicon up until recently, even back when Prozac was being pulled, this early studies on Prozac, and they were bringing it to market in the mid 80s, there was talk about antidepressant withdrawal. So the manufacturers have known that this is a thing since the very beginning of the second generation of SSRIs that we're generally talking about here. But the wording was switched to something called antidepressant discontinuation syndrome. This was something that the pharmaceutical companies did on purpose to kind of mitigate the severity of withdrawal. And it's just sort of stuck. So if you go on the Mayo Clinic right now and you look at their website, this is what they'll say is what antidepressant withdrawal is. They'll say it lasts a few weeks at most, that for most people it's mild if it even happens at all. And they describe something that sounds unpleasant, but frankly, I think anyone would say, I can handle that for a couple weeks. Like, I want to get off these drugs for whatever reason. In my case, I just needed to see my baseline, but sometimes people are wanting to start a family, and there's contraindications with antidepressants and pregnancy and birth, so we want to change it. Maybe people are having side effects that aren't working. Whatever it is, we shouldn't have to explain ourselves, but this is kind of what most clinicians will say is going to happen. This is what my clinician said would happen, and I said, I can handle that. I've got a couple weeks. It was March. I didn't leave the country till August. I thought I had time. But what actually happened to me looked more like this. None of this was listed on any of the websites at the time. It's a bit more common now. But my psychiatrist never mentioned any of these words. Many of these words were new to me: tardive dyskinesia, akathisia, derealization. And if she had told me that this was a possibility, one, I honestly don't know if I would have gotten off the drugs, but when I realized that this was what was happening, I just got extremely angry because nobody had told me about this. I had been taking these drugs for 15 years and didn't know that I was experiencing memory loss as a direct result of them. And again, if she had told me about this, she may have only told me that this would last for, let's say, 2 weeks, 4 weeks. She didn't tell me that it could last for months or years. In my case, I was in severe withdrawal for a year, and then less severe withdrawal for another year after that. So there's probably some, I'll probably come back to that more detail on my side effects, but I just want to give you a general overview. The point of this is, if you know, we've got a lot of therapists in this room, right? If someone came in and was describing these symptoms, what would happen? Probably most of you would pull out your DSM, maybe look at it, there would be a diagnosis, right? I know that you guys can't prescribe, but God forbid somebody walks in with these symptoms into a psychiatrist, they're immediately going to be labeled with a mental illness, when in reality this was just a reaction from having a drug pulled out of their system. And that is the big problem we have in the mental health world right now, is that these drugs are causing symptoms that look like mental illnesses, and then we are medicating and misdiagnosing, and people are ending up on a carousel of hell, basically. So because we're trying to bring more awareness to withdrawal specifically, and I use the word antidepressant withdrawal a lot today. I'm talking all psychiatric drugs. This is true for antipsychotics, mood stabilizers, anti-anxiety drugs, benzos, Adderall, Ritalin, all of that. All of this can happen, so let's consider it a little bit of a catch-all, but I will specifically use the word antidepressant withdrawal most of the time. So now that we have been in this for a while, it's been about over 30 years since antidepressants have been on the market. So even though they've only been studied for a short period of time, like 4 to 12 weeks, we have people like me who have been on them for decades. And because there's no real research about taking people off or even just awareness of withdrawal, there have been communities that have been popping up online since about 2014. And in these communities, we've really started to figure out what is happening with people, the safer ways to pull people off, and there's a whole language that has developed around antidepressant withdrawal. And so I'm sharing this with you just in case you ever have a family member or a student who's going through this, you might start to understand the language that can be used. The first thing is called windows and waves. Think of this as the ebb and flow of withdrawal. It means that when you have a window, you kind of get an insight into who you might be when you're off these drugs. And then when you have a wave, it's like you just get hit with all those symptoms from the previous slide. And this can happen at a really rapid rate. Literally for me, I could switch from a window to wave in a matter of seconds, minutes, or even hours. So I could be in a window like wave like this all day long. It was just up and down and up and down. But that's not how it presents for everyone. Some people have windows that last for a couple days, and then they'll have waves that last for a couple days. Other people will have it last weeks to weeks, some people months to month. It's completely random. And that's another thing to keep in mind about all this, is that the way people experience withdrawal and psychiatric drug withdrawal is wildly different from person to person, which makes it very hard to study and also very confusing for everyone involved. I've got a friend of mine who's I'm going to talk about, a little bit throughout this presentation. His windows and waves were very predictable in that they lasted about 4 hours. He would start with an anxiety spike, and then once he got through the anxiety spike, his body would basically overcorrect. He would plummet into a depression and be extremely depressed for about an hour, and then he would start to come up and be a little bit more in homeostasis. And this could happen usually once a day. The anxiety was worse in the morning, the depression was worse in the evening, and that was someone who's been tapering off of 40 milligrams of Prozac very slowly. And so it helped to chart this, and we would see the patterns. But another person I'm supporting, every time he makes a cut, he's good for about 12 days. Then he hits a wave for about 2 weeks. And he's cutting once every 4 to 6 weeks. So it's just highly unpredictable in the way it hits people. All right, this is a little bit technical here. It's just a little bit of some of the research. I'll just quickly go over it. Antidepressant withdrawal didn't really enter into the lexicon until about 2015, is when the first systematic review of the existing literature was looking for it. So if you think about that, it took about 30 years of prescribing these drugs before somebody said, wait a second, let's look at this. And we've had a little bit of reviews since then, and the data that's coming back is that we're seeing that about 56% of users experience withdrawal, so half, and 46% of those users say it's severe. What that means is roughly 1 in 4 people on antidepressants, and this is antidepressant specific, will experience severe withdrawal, which, given that we've got 45 million people in this country, around 1 in 4 on these drugs, that's a lot, right? But only 2% of people were actually informed of withdrawal symptoms before they were given these drugs. So we can start to see where this big gap is happening and where we have such a problem. The symptoms are more common and intense with high doses of half-life drugs. So those are drugs that leave the system theoretically quickly. That's your Effexor, your Paxil. Prozac has a longer half-life. So Effexor has a half-life of about 18 hours. And so that leaves the blood quickly, but it is more likely to cause really high withdrawal symptoms. Same is true for your Xanaxes, your fast-acting drugs like your benzos. I'm going to briefly mention, so when we're doing half-lives, it usually is measured by the blood. So we're looking at the amount of the drug that stays in the blood over time. This is going to become kind of important later when we explain why we think this is happening to people. So just keep that in mind, but the details aren't too important here. All right, so there are 3 types of withdrawal. And again, this is super important to know really for all of you guys in here, because whether or not you're working with people in the in the law enforcement system, or you're working with kids, you could be, even if they stop a drug, you could be running into withdrawal for a goodly length of time after they stop it. The first type of withdrawal is acute withdrawal. This is the initial phase of withdrawal. It's basically, if you've ever had too much to drink and you wake up the next morning and you have a headache, that's withdrawal. That's alcohol withdrawal. If you have a hair of the dog, you feel better. That's a perfect example of acute withdrawal. It occurs shortly after the drug is removed from the system, or a dose change happens. And the symptoms typically emerge between hours to a few weeks after discontinuation. And they also alleviate within a few weeks to a few months typically. So acute withdrawal is what most clinicians think withdrawal is. They think, oh, you might feel like you have the flu for a little bit and then you're okay. But the problem is that there are 2 other types of withdrawal that are important to know. And acute withdrawal can turn into something called protracted withdrawal. Protracted withdrawal is why there's such a movement right now to address psychiatric drug withdrawal, because protracted withdrawal is the type of withdrawal that doesn't go away, and at least not quickly. It can last months or years. It's what I had. It's also called post-acute withdrawal syndrome. And it goes well beyond the acute phase. I mean, this is when we're talking months or years, and really horrible stories I've heard of people in significant protracted withdrawal for a decade or more. I will say that's rare. It is more common in the stories that I hear and the people who reach out to me and that I work with, where people are in it for about 1 to 2 years. But that's still a significant length of time when nobody ever told you that this was going to happen and you didn't sign up for it, and it can kind of ruin your life. So it's also very highly likely to be misdiagnosed as a relapse or emergence of a new mental illness. Because again, what you're going to go to a doctor and you're going to say, it's been 6 months, I'm still experiencing all those symptoms. And they'll say, well, it seems like you're bipolar now because it looks like bipolar. And then the next thing you know, you're on a mood stabilizer. And this just happens over and over and over again until people really hit a point where their body just starts to break down. In that similar vein, there's something called delayed onset withdrawal. This is probably the most confounding of all the withdrawal because this will present in people who have no problem stepping off the drug. They can do typically a linear taper or a relatively fast taper, feel fine. They get off the drug, they feel fine, and then a couple weeks up to a few months later, they just get hit with withdrawal. And this happens suddenly. I mean, quite literally, I've heard stories of someone eating the wrong food that sends them into withdrawal. I've heard people say that one night they just didn't sleep, and then now they're stuck in withdrawal. And nobody understands why this happens. It doesn't make any sense, but the symptoms are so clearly withdrawal and not the emergence of something else that we do know it's withdrawal. And this is where people are most likely to be misdiagnosed because again, you're fine, you're fine, you're fine, and then all of a sudden you're having all those symptoms and now you're schizophrenic too, right? This is like literally what happens. I'm not exaggerating here, unfortunately. So we're just going to go back here for a second. And again, this is what we think withdrawal was, but this is what it actually is. So if you think of the 3 types of withdrawal that we just talked about, apply all of this to it, and now suddenly this is happening to people. You can see why we have such a big problem currently in our mental health system. I am going to show you, I'm going to focus a little bit on something called akathisia right now. And the reason why I'm going to do this is because this is probably the most dangerous side effect of withdrawal. I've seen it happen in kids. I've seen it happen in just with people who have been on these drugs for a long time. It's defined as an inability to remain still. It's not really a great way to put it. There are some Parkinson's-like syndromes, but people describe it as like every nerve is on fire. And this is the one symptom that is most likely to lead people to kill themselves, which is why I'm bringing it up. If we see this, we know we really are in a serious situation here. And so I'm going to share a video. This was from a young woman named Danielle, I think I can play it, who gave me permission to play this. And she has been hospitalized multiple times for akathisia. She was medicated as a child, and this is from when she was in a hospital. Let's see if we can play it here. There we go. So you can see she has these tremors, and if you've got a lot of, we see this sometimes in folks on the street. This will happen when they're not able to get their drugs regularly, right? So the drugs can cause this sort of tremors, and then also when you pull them off too quickly, they can shake as well. So I just wanted to show what that is. And it's also really physically painful. It's not just like not being able to move, it's very physically painful as well. All right. Okay, so there's 3 groups of people who are most likely to encounter withdrawal. And the first is folks who are on psych drugs for long periods of time. We're going to call that 2+ years. The reason I'm saying 2 years is because there's really no literature past 2 years. So again, these drugs have been on the market for 30 years. I was on them for 15. There's not a single piece of long-term literature that's looking at people on these drugs for more than 2 years. I say that extra care needs to be taken at 5+ years. This is pure anecdotal. It's just that once we see people on these drugs for 5 years, they've spent enough time on there where their body is really adapted and it can be more difficult to pull them off. And lastly, we need to take caution if they were medicated as children and teens. Danielle was medicated as a child, and the problem is that your whole body develops on these drugs, around these drugs, and we have, again, no literature, not one piece of literature that is talking about how we're affecting the bodies and minds of young people who are on these drugs. But again, I know from anecdotes of working with people and just this community that the people who are most at risk were medicated as kids because our body doesn't know how to operate without these drugs, and it takes a long time to build it back. We also need to look out for folks who are experiencing polypharmacy, which means you're on multiple drugs. Now, this is anyone who's ever been involved with someone towards the end of their life knows what a problem this can be, because you have one drug to fix one problem, and then you're put on another drug to fix the problem that the first drug is on, and it stacks. And there is not a single human on this planet who understands how these drugs work together. There may be a few who understand a drug-drug interaction. For example, methylene blue and SSRIs. Methylene blue is something they use in hospitals for CO2 poisoning. So if you're on SSRIs and you end up with CO2 poisoning and they put you on methylene blue in a hospital, we know that there's a contraindication there that is likely to cause something called serotonin syndrome. But there is not a human on the planet who knows drug-drug-drug interaction, drug-drug-drug-drug-drug interaction. I was on 6 different drugs. I promise you no one knows what happens there. AI might. This is an interesting angle of AI in medicine that may actually be able to help us a little bit more with these drug interactions. But at this point, absolutely no doctor on the planet knows. And this creates something called iatrogenic harm, which is when you are injured by the treatment itself, and then ultimately people usually get medicated for it and we have issues. Well, this is a little technical here, but the CYP system, which is our genetic pathways, that starts to get bogged down, and we think that that might be why people are having these problems. The last group that we kind of need to watch out for is hypersensitivity, and I think that this is especially important in kids, because usually when I talk to people who were medicated as kids, the most common thing they say is that they were sensitive. They were a sensitive kid. They either had food allergies, or they had big feelings, or they just felt like the world was a little overwhelming. And then we throw these drugs at them and wonder why sometimes they don't do too well on them. These people also have trouble typically processing caffeine, alcohol, or sugar. And this hypersensitivity to the drug can actually manifest over time. So you may not have started off sensitive to a drug, but then you're on it for 10 years and you start developing these sensitivities. This is a pretty hallmark sign of people who are oversensitive to these drugs. There's also likely a genetic component here, but we have not gotten anywhere near figuring out what that might actually be. All right, so this is a chart made by a father of a young adult son who was medicated with 19 different drugs and 19 different psych drugs in 3 years. I wish I could tell you that this was uncommon, and it's just not. It might be a little on the end of the extreme, but I mean, I was on 6 different drugs and nobody batted an eye about that for 15 years. So you can see the length of time he was on the drugs across the bottom. Oops, my little laser's not working. I tried, David. Length of time across the bottom, number of drugs over on the type of drug over on the right. There's the combination of antidepressants, antipsychotics, pretty much everything you could find there, and then the dose. And you can see the speed at which this person is being pulled off and put on different drugs and how it's all layered. And again, there's not a single human on this planet who understands what that does to a person. But what we do know is that this young man was not doing well. Now, I don't quite remember the context of this. I feel like maybe he had like a first episode of psychosis and that was it. But this ended up being the trajectory. I also don't know how he's doing today, but obviously this process itself was not doing too well. So here we go into this CYP thing. I'm gonna go through this just quickly enough. Again, I think the foundation is important for you guys to know here, just because a lot of this stuff's not out there. So if you Google it, you're not gonna find it, but it's gonna inform our bigger conversations. So these are the drugs that I was on, the 6 different drugs. And this is basically the genetic pathway. And so if you think of your body and your metabolism, I'm not talking metabolism like how many calories you eat in a day. I'm talking metabolism like how your body processes everything we put into it. We have different pathways through the CYP system, the CYP system. And basically what you're seeing here is the different pathways that drugs are metabolized by a set number of these isoforms, and when they get bogged down, you can have problems in the body. So everything that's yellow is where two or more drugs are being metabolized by that pathway. Everything that's orange is 3 or more drugs, and everything that's red is 4 or more drugs. So 3A4 was really bogged down with my body. And so we think that maybe part of what's happening here is when you start to pull these drugs up, suddenly it's like a free-for-all. It's like the funnel, the dam's been opened. The body doesn't know how to process anymore, and things just go a little bit haywire. This is a friend of mine who I was helping withdrawal. 39-year-old man tapering off of 40 milligrams of Prozac. You've got all the drugs he was on the left. Most of those are so the fluoxetine is the Prozac. Everything else was supplements that we were using in order to help manage this withdrawal process a little bit. But I want you guys to see what happens when we pull the Prozac out. Things just get a lot clearer. And again, we just don't know how this is really affecting people, but this amazing tool over here is from some Dutch researchers who are just looking to figure out drug-drug interactions. It's the whole point of this tool. You can put in any drug for any ailment and see how the body is metabolizing them. So this is kind of the base of a theory, but there's no formal research around this. But the idea is just that if you're bogging down all these systems, the body's going to compensate by not working very well. And when you pull things out, you're going to change the ratio. So for example, if you're making soup and you have carrots and celery and onion in there and you eat it, it tastes nice. If you suddenly pull out all the carrots, you're going to taste a lot more celery, right? That's the same thing that we think is sort of happening in the body. We don't exactly know how it's manifesting, but there's something to it there. So the highest use trifecta, or the highest risk trifecta here is going to be our long-term users, beginning as a minor, polypharmacy, and hypersensitivity. I think this is especially noteworthy for our law enforcement friends here in the room, because I know that you've got a lot of people in this system who can be on a lot of these drugs, and I think it's making them more difficult to deal with, and then we just keep throwing drugs at them and wondering why things aren't going very well. And if we're going to take it to the extreme, the violent angle, this can be what is happening. Okay, I'm going to go through this pretty quickly since we don't have any clinicians in here, but very often the question is, well, what's relapse and what's withdrawal? The biggest thing is that withdrawal symptoms come on quickly. They may seem the same, but quite literally, for me, it happened in a moment. I was walking on the street, one moment I was fine, one moment I wasn't, and all the symptoms came at once. Relapses, I mean, there's some arguments to be made about what a relapse really is anyway, or what mental illness is. We're not going to go to that philosophical conversation, but that's usually a bit more gradual. It can be induced by life experience, something happening. Withdrawal tends to be fast. It goes from 0 to 100 quite fast. But given how many people experience withdrawal, at least half, we really need to start assuming that these symptoms are withdrawal and not relapse, because if we keep throwing drugs at people, we're not actually addressing the problem, and we're also throwing drugs at systems that are telling us that they're compromised, and that's only making people worse. What is particularly noteworthy here is that not a single piece of the research on antidepressants, so very often in this space, especially on social media, when people are getting their backs up in the wall about mental health drugs and over-medication and whatnot, they often say, trust the science. They say, trust the science. Look at the science. The science says, but there's a big problem in this world, and that is that not one piece of the major research that has been done in the past 30 years has ever included withdrawal as part of the study. That means that every time we finish a study or someone drops out of a study and we're looking at the stay well rates, we pull those people off the drugs right away, look and see how they're doing, and when they don't do well, very often what will happen is the researchers will just throw them out. They'll say, oh, they were non-responders. They get thrown out. So the research is all skewed because we're not considering withdrawal, and this is especially true in studies where we've moved people from one drug to another and looked at how they've done. So that's just it's such a hole. It's such a frustrating hole. It means that you literally can't trust the science. And well, I wish there was more science on this, but there's just not. Okay, so how to avoid antidepressant withdrawal? Maybe. I say maybe because we don't really know here. And sorry, David, he told me not to swear. I didn't, and the slide did. But this is so new. This is so new. I mean, the reason why the chef is up here is because the doctors don't know what's going on, right? So we really have to acknowledge that this is the Wild West territory, and everybody involved right now is just in an experiment. But I think the most thing that we need to remember the most is that this is typically how we view side effects, right? Like we have people on either end of the spectrum who are having severe reactions. And in this case, severe, it could just mean like they're having no reaction, right? Because that's rare too. It's very rare that people get off these drugs and have no problem. So they're at the easy to spot end of either spectrum. This is usually the stuff we hear about. We hear people telling horror stories, or we hear people saying, I have no problem at all. We miss all this middle stuff, and I think that's where a lot of the misdiagnosis is happening, because you've got, you know, people who are being put on these drugs for hot flashes and grief, and then they have a minor reaction and we don't notice. They just think they're depressed, mentally ill, and they stay on these drugs forever. I'm going to skip past this because it's a little technical, but I'm going to stop here. So if you remember earlier, I talked about the blood concentration of these drugs and the half-life, and how people will think, oh, the drug's been out of my system for 2 weeks, I should be fine, and I'm not. That must mean I'm still ill. We're missing something called serotonin occupancy. Basically, the ratio of the amount of blood, or the amount of drug in the blood does not line up with the amount of drug in the brain. And that's kind of the moral of the story here. And what happens is that when you take these drugs, they're not synthetic. They're not a synthetic bioidentical variation of serotonin or dopamine or whatever it is, but they're a molecule that can fit in the neurotransmitters and block natural serotonin or dopamine or whatever it is from being used by the body. The problem is that the antidepressants, they get sticky. So it's kind of like they just stick in the brain, and then when we pull them away, they don't titrate out of the system very quickly. And let's see, I don't know if I can get this to... All right, so let's go on the upper left. That's venlafaxine. That was the drug I was on. The lowest dose on the market is 37.5 milligrams, which is going to be right in the middle of the 0 to 50 on the bottom dose axis. But you can see, I know it's a little hard to read, but at about 37.5 milligrams, the serotonin occupancy, meaning the amount of drug occupying the receptors, is about 60%. So when I was pulled off the drugs right away without tapering properly, all my receptors were still bogged down at about a 60% rate. And we think that this is part of the reason why these intense withdrawal reactions happen to people, because the brain is not adapting at the rate the drug is being taken out of the body. And so if I had access to 20 milligrams, 10 milligrams, 5 milligrams, 1 milligram at a time, I could have stepped down at a rate that would line up with the way the drug was actually interacting with my brain. That's the theory of where we are on withdrawal right now. It's called hyperbolic tapering is the strategy, but it's not particularly well known, and it's complicated because you can't get 20 milligrams, 10 milligrams, 5 milligrams of so many of these drugs. But this is also why if somebody stops a psychiatric drug and then all of a sudden they have problems down the line, this is why. It's because their brain is not adapting at the rate of the drug that it may or may not be in their blood or in their system. Again, it's just tricky. We need withdrawal-informed clinicians, of which there are extremely few. Honestly, I don't even know if I have one in Ohio. I have a list of withdrawal-informed physicians and clinicians, and I'm trying to get one in each state. I think Ohio is one of the states I'm missing, in case anybody here knows somebody. But that just tells you how difficult this is, right? Like, nobody ever said anything about this when I was coming off my drugs, and people are reaching out to me all the time. They're just looking for anyone who knows how to do this and has any ability to find a compound pharmacy and understand a taper schedule. And it needs to really be patient-directed and patient-dedicated because it's tedious. It can take people years to get off these drugs. And because it's so individual, people go at different speeds. There's not a one size fits all. And the prescriber needs to know that this is not a situation where we show up to the doctor's office and say, doctor, tell me what to do. That is a recipe for things not working out very well. There are some exceptions to these rules. I'm going to skip past this because it's a little too technical, unless we had some doctors in the room. But the reason why this is relevant to providers outside of psychiatry is because people's moods and their sudden mood swings and maybe their impulsive thoughts or their health is relevant to everyone, right? I mean, this is extreme, and I know it's rather unfashionable to talk about, but people who commit violent crimes while coming off of psychiatric drugs it happens. I'm not going to say it's common, but it does happen, and it's missed, right? There are many, maybe there's at least a dozen court cases that I know of where people have actually been exonerated from the crimes they committed because it has been shown that these drugs were toxic to their system. It sent them into a psychotic state, and they're walking free despite having done something horrible. So that's how it affects law enforcement. It affects kids because we've got our kids who are showing ADHD symptoms, or they can't pay attention, or they're having emotional outbursts. And it could be because their drugs are getting messed with. I mean, there's a family I was working with in Reno where there was a little boy who was living between two different parents. The mom didn't like that he was medicated. The dad was trying to stay on the schedule, so he'd switch locations every couple days. Mom wouldn't give him his drugs, and dad would. This kid was a wreck, and everybody just thought it was the kid, right? Because it's not like an aspirin. It's not like that. So that's how it can affect kids. Let alone just the developing minds. I mean, even, for example, different types of doctors. You know, I had a story that was told to me yesterday about a family who the wife was medicated on 100 milligrams of Zoloft for hot flashes, and her personality changed so much that it completely ruined their marriage, and now she's dependent on these drugs. For me, it induced multiple iatrogenic, so other illnesses. And so the next thing you know, I'm on thyroid drugs, I'm on something called bile reflux disease. And at no point did any of the clinicians ever question that maybe the antidepressants were causing this. So it's such a Pandora's box of issues. And it's way more than just psychiatry. All right, so I was a kid, I was 15 years old, whose father had died. And yes, I was showing symptoms of classic depression and anxiety, which according to the DSM meant I was mentally ill because I showed them for longer than 2 weeks. Could easily draw a bullseye around many things in the DSM and apply it to me at that time in my life. But at no point was I in a state of acute crisis. You know, I wasn't doing drugs on the street, I wasn't getting pregnant, I wasn't out of control, I was just struggling. And so the choice was made to medicate me, which is what we'll talk about a little bit later with my mom. But basically, I had one 15-minute appointment with a child psychiatrist, and ultimately that led to being medicated with 32,760 pills from age 15 to 30. I did the math on this. I spent a lot of time doing math on weird things at this point in my life because I was trying to quantify something that I couldn't understand emotionally. But there's been a long cascade of effects that I'm still dealing with today, even though it has been 9 years since I got off the drugs. The first thing is that I have irreversible memory loss around this time. This was something I didn't realize was happening until I started hearing from the people around me that we would have conversations, and I wasn't recalling the conversations. And then there's a lot of memory loss from the early years of medication too. Some of that probably had to do with the trauma of losing my dad. He died in a very sudden way. But I think it was the drugs, a good portion of it, because as soon as I started to get off of them, my short-term and long-term memory started to stick. I have not recovered many of the memories from the time I was medicated, but my memory now in the past 9 years has significantly improved, and I did nothing to improve that other than remove these drugs from my system. I have postmenopausal hormone levels and something called PSSD, or at least PSSD complications. This, I think, is because this is not a one-time test. We've been testing this for years, the hormone levels. And I think what has happened, because it's the one part of my physiology that really has not leveled off, I think it's because I was medicated at 15, right at the start of puberty, and my body just never had a shot and doesn't really know what to do. So this is an issue we're still trying to crack. I also hear this from a lot of people who are medicated as kids. And I don't know what that means for me. Like, I don't have a family at this point. I don't know if it's possible or it's ever going to happen. I do know that by the time I got off of these drugs and then went through the process of withdrawal and healing, I've now kind of aged out of a lot of that opportunity. And there's a part of me that feels like that was taken from me, like I didn't really have a choice in that matter, and that can be very frustrating. PSSD is something called post-SSRI sexual dysfunction. It can just be in the realm of sexual functioning and reproductive health. It also can be a whole body issue where basically we think it's connected to nerves, where your nerves really get shut down and desensitized. So if you think of this, it makes sense because what these drugs do is they numb your edges. They balance you out. They say they take the highs and the lows away, right? But that's going to be true for your entire body, your entire physiology. So we're also taking the sensitivity away from even just the feeling of any sort of touch or even emotional connection. I've been struggling with IBS for years. That's specifically managed by severe dietary restriction. So this is purely because these drugs are unbelievably difficult on your gut. 90% of our serotonin is created in our gut. These drugs affect the serotonin system. The fact that we're told that these are affecting our brain and our mood and nobody has mentioned that all that good gut stuff is being created in our belly is wild to me. So when I got off the drugs and started pulling them out, I've spent the past 9 years really trying to figure out how to just eat and exist in the world. And I primarily eat a combination of meat, fish, fruit, very little vegetables. I don't do well. Some nuts, it's kind of about it. I can have coffee, can't do alcohol. And that is, again, this is all new. This isn't something that existed when I was younger. It happened in the period of withdrawal, pulling these drugs out. I have extreme noise sensitivity. This is one of the symptoms that hasn't really gotten, it's gotten a little better. I can manage it better. But again, if we think of these drugs as numbing the whole body, it's kind of like you're wearing a full body earplug and then all of a sudden you pull everything away and all the senses get really intense. So my vision, my smell, taste, and noise specifically. And it's kind of like it's not just a sensitivity to the intensity, which it is. It's also like I can't hear when multiple things are going on. Like one sound will really take over and it makes it very hard to process. So it's like a sensory processing thing at this point. This one's tricky, and this is one of the ones that I'm very concerned about when it comes to our children. I think that when you medicate people early, they create a diminished ability to form and maintain relationships. And this can I think this can meet a lot of the criteria for being on the autistic spectrum, which is really super frustrating because that's not what it is. It's in the same way that you feel like you have this earplug over you the whole time. It's the same for other people and humans. And it feels just kind of like there's this fog in between you and somebody else, and you don't entirely understand what they're saying, how to communicate with them, how to manage a situation, but it's subtle. It's not like anyone would know, but it's definitely there. And for a long time, I thought that this was just me. Like I completely just thought that I didn't quite have the social skills that I should have. And then I realized after talking to other people who've been medicating as kids that this is a very real thing, that we're all sort of missing something. And I think it really is. We were supposed to learn these social skills and these social cues and how to flirt and how to manage a room and know what's good and bad, whatever it is, and then we just kind of can't, because it's like you can't fully take in all the information. It's a very difficult thing to explain, but if you've experienced it, you know it. And I've now heard this enough from people who were medicated when they were young to know that this is very much a real thing. This one's fun. I have a huge distrust of doctors, which I don't know if that's good or bad. I haven't exactly had a great experience with most of the doctors in my life. On the other hand, if I get in a car accident, please take me to a doctor. And I'm not here to disparage the field. I realize that they are a byproduct of a bad system too. But what's been so frustrating to me is that over the years, the more I've talked about this, it's like there are some doctors that are amazing. They just want to listen. They want to do better. They remember why they got into the field. But there are so many who just get defensive. They gaslight, they tell you you're wrong, that these things can't happen. And especially with social media and the internet now, it's baffling to me that as patients, we still have to argue for our own experience. I just don't understand how someone who's known me for 15 minutes can assume they know what's going on with me. And I get it's the system, it's the insurance, it's the culture in this country, it's a mess, but it has continued to plague me even through non-mental health stuff. I had a knee surgery, if you catch me hobbling around last year, and getting my doctors to listen to me because I've had a complicated recovery has just been insane. And I just don't understand why we have to fight so hard, but it keeps happening. I also calculated that I have lost over $1 million in earning potential. This is because when you're medicated as a kid, what happens is you're cut off from yourself. You're not fully in tune with who you are and what you like. Sometimes you're making choices based on kind of living in another person's life. And if you're depressed, these drugs don't do anything to address the root cause of depression. All they do is make it a little easier to tolerate whatever system or situation you're in. And what happens then is that, at least for me, you tend to start making choices based on the path of least resistance. It is so much easier to tolerate a bad situation that you tolerate it. And so you tolerate work that's not right for you. You tolerate people that's not right for you, but you'd never actually start thriving. And so when you're not thriving, you're not doing things that you love or you want to be doing, you lose the drive to improve your life and to, in my case, make more money. So the reason why I calculated this financial thing specifically is because I noticed that when I got off the drugs, I started working a lot more. Like I had just the desire to work. I had ambition again, and then I naturally started making more money. And this was such a severe shift that I was shocked by it. And I realized that when I was medicated, I didn't want to be alive, and so I didn't want a future, so I never planned for one. So I never learned about investing. I never thought about self-preservation. I wasn't doing anything to preserve. And when I took all my 15 years of income versus what I'm making now, accounted for inflation, because of course I do the details on this, and also just the natural increase in making more money as you get older, I still calculated that it's been about $1 million in lost earning potential. All right, so what's the solution here? Hopefully, as the day goes on, we're going to take a little bit more of a hopeful note as we go through, but there's a couple things. The first thing is that if you are considering getting off of your psychiatric drugs, or you are working with children and you're changing doses, if they have reactions that seem out of the blue, we need to assume it's withdrawal and not another problem. That is the number one thing, is that anything that happens when you're changing the dose of a drug or getting off of it should be assumed as withdrawal. We also need to look at the reality, which is that we have been medicating people now for 70 years on early tricyclic drugs going into second generation drugs. And we're not better, we're worse. Every single metric in the world of mental health and suicide is worse than it was when we started this. And sometimes people will say, oh, it's just being diagnosed more often now. I don't think that's the case, because people still aren't doing better. It's not like we're diagnosing more often, medicating them, and seeing people thrive. The opposite is happening. We also need to address that there is a level of dependence here that's happening. I don't know if, I'm sure some folks in this room saw what happened at RFK's confirmation, where there was a bit of a scuffle when RFK said that he has family members who have had a more difficult time getting off of heroin than antidepressants, and that just sent the media off in a whole way, like saying that we were comparing people with mental illness to addicts, and it was a mess. And what was really needed to be said there was that these drugs create physical dependence. That does not mean people are addicts. It just means that we have created physical dependence, and the body is used to being on these drugs. And so when we remove them, we can expect a rebound reaction. But again, that is not part of the common conversation around this, so then nobody knows. And then we get these really reductive articles and media crap that is just, it doesn't help. This is a list, a very short list of folks who are working on this issue. I might I might recommend writing down just a couple names if you're interested in what's being said here. Anything you find from these folks is going to be interesting and further this conversation. The folks who are focusing on withdrawal specifically, that's going to be Mark Horowitz. Let's see, who else here? David Healy, too. Probably one of my favorite names on this list that doesn't get a lot of attention is Ben Goldacre. He's an MD and journalist, and he writes a lot about bad science. He'll specifically break down the problems with the FDA, how publication bias in science. He'll teach you how to read a paper and be able to point out the problems. His work, he has a book called Bad Science, and I think it should be required reading for every high school student. I also really like the work. Johan Hari's great. He's a journalist. He has a book called Lost Connections, which goes into a lot of the problems with these drugs, but also how to recreate connection and get people out of depression and mental illness. Gretchen Lefevre-Watson's work I would also highly recommend. She specializes in ADHD, and she's been doing this for 30, 40 years. She found that in her work, she did a study of over 30,000 people in the Virginia area, and she created an intervention that trained the parents and the teachers. Not once did they interact with kids during this study. They had a 78% increase in test scores, I believe, and also about a 70% decrease in problematic behavior associated with ADHD in schools, and this was without any sort of medical intervention with the kids. We were literally training the parents and teachers, and she had a huge reversal rate, far higher than any drug. Sorry, what? That's Gretchen Lefevre-Watson. Oh, and for my law enforcement friends, the Selma Eichenberg-Schieveld, her work is amazing. She specifically studies the genetic metabolism of antidepressants and how they're connected to violence. So she's a forensic researcher. She's done autopsies on like the Aurora shooter and a bunch of these mass criminals, and she's charting their genetics and has pointed out the actual genetic components that she thinks are required that creates this violent reaction. And it's rare, but it happens. And so it's just an added angle of this that is very difficult to talk about without ending up in a political nightmare. The last thing we need to is true informed consent. So that's part of why I'm here today. Like, none of this information was ever told to me. It's probably never been told to anyone in this room, but that is what true informed consent would look like. I have admittedly not focused on whatever positive benefits there could be from taking these drugs, because I think the past 35 years of society has done a well enough job of that. There's not enough people talking about this side. And I think that this is a conversation that we'll get into with my mother as well, because the bottom line is that parents aren't informed about this stuff either. I mean, if someone had asked, if you had the sense to ask my psychiatrist at the time, what studies have been done to show how these drugs are affecting kids? And he said, I don't know. Like, that would have been a different conversation. I don't know if we were here today, right? So that's not happening. Right now, informed consent is an electronic signature you give before you even see the doctor. And it's designed to protect the doctor, not the patient. And I don't know the solution of how we make this a requirement. I think this is really going to be largely clinician driven, and patients need to demand it. But informed consent means we know both the pros and cons of all these drugs, because the bottom line is you cannot consent if you don't have the information. You're not consenting to what you're just not consenting. You're being given a half truth. And you guys have seen this photo here, but the one on the right is of me in withdrawal. The one on the left is me, probably within a couple months of being medicated. So there are 15 years in between, but also there's just a difference in the eyes. I think you can really see it. And it's very fascinating to me because I can see this in other people too. I think if you line 10 people up in a room and half of them were medicated, I could probably tell you which ones were medicated based on the way their eyes look. It's subtle, but there's something there. And it's now been 9 years since I was pulled off my drugs, so I've got another 6 before I can start reaching the halfway point of spending more time, well, actually, no, my math, I've spent more time unmedicated than not now, but as an adult, still got about 6 years to go. And I am still a chef by trade. That's my main line of work, but I consider this my advocacy and volunteer work, because if you saw my inboxes, you would do it too, right? Like, I shouldn't be the one in this position, but until the doctors start stepping up, I am. And that's why I wrote my book, and I'm thrilled that it was bought by a wonderful publisher who nurtured it and has gotten it out there. And so I'm just very happy to be here. Thank you so much for your warm reception, and it's exactly 10 o'clock. Yeah, I can take questions now.
So we have a mic here. We thought it'd be better to have a stationary mic if you're willing to come up and ask Brooke a question. Otherwise, I'm running across the room.
Yeah. You can just yell too. I'll hear you.
Or you can yell, but so please, we've got a little bit of time before our next presentation. Please take advantage of this, and Brooke's willing to answer any questions you might have. So shout them out or come on up.
Oh, good, because if no one had a question, I was just going to keep talking and probably need to stop that.
So my question is, as I'm approaching the mic, my question is, you had mentioned a list of doctors who are certified or credentialed in tapering. Mm-hmm. And what is the criteria for that? Because we where I work have a lot of physicians, and yeah, I know they do taper off their meds. So what's the criteria for that?
There isn't one, which again, baffling, right? So unfortunately this is, like I said, the first mention of this in the literature was not until 2015. I think COVID kind of prompted a lot of this stuff, but there's no formal training. There's no real understanding. There's a book that just came out called the Maudsley Deprescribing Guidelines that came out in 2024, early last year. And it's based out of the UK, where we have some guidelines, but the bottom line is everyone is kind of spitting in the dark here.
Sure.
And the big thing to understand is that typically most prescribers are tapering people off in a linear fashion. By that, I mean we're starting at 100 milligrams, we go to 75 to 50, 25, it makes a straight line. But based on the work of a bunch of the researchers whose names are on the board, and also the community peer groups that have existed on the internet since, roughly the early 2010s, we're starting to notice now that people are doing better if they follow that hyperbolic curve, so that round curve when we saw the serotonin occupancy. So what we're trying to do is match up the speed of the taper with that curve. That works better. I'm not going to tell you it works in every case. Sure. We've got, a lot of the folks my mom works with are doing that exactly, and they're still really struggling. So it's certainly not a panacea, but it seems to help more than the previous, for sure. So really it's just about educating them on hyperbolic tapering, Maudsley, and hoping that on their off time they're going to do a little bit of research on this and at least learn to recognize the symptoms of withdrawal, because that means that we're probably going too fast. And that's the real thing. We typically need to really slow people down when we're tapering, and especially in hospital settings, it's not happening like that.
One other question, have you had any reaction from the pharmaceutical industry to your book or your presentations?
Not yet. And I don't know if that's just because I haven't hit critical mass, or if it's because, I'm not sure. I don't know why I haven't had too much of a negative reaction. Honestly, the worst reaction I get is from people, like just regular patients. They get very angry and defensive, but I've only had one doctor in 9 years who's gotten kind of cranky about this at me directly, and so far no major pushback elsewhere. But I think a big part of it is I'm just sharing my story, right? And this is the information that I've known and gathered. I'm actually probably a little bit more conservative in the world of withdrawal as far as what the right call is, because I look around and I'm like, we don't really know what's happening here. There are other folks in the space who will say you have to do it this way. And that to me is, and I'm not coaching people, I don't have a business around this either. I think that helps because I'm not kind of trying to work a financial angle from it, even though I think that we definitely need those people, and thank God that they exist. We need peer counselors and coaches.
I just wanted, sorry, I just wanted to say I really appreciate it.
You're welcome.
You know, you went through a lot, and you're helping people as well.
Thank you.
Because I kind of was in a similar situation. I was on psychiatric meds. My dad was, it was more like trauma than actual schizophrenia, but yeah, so.
What a concept. Something horrible happened and the body doesn't really know how to deal with it. Like,
Yeah, and it's like you're diagnosed, and it's like then it's like
Yeah.
after a while you take yourself off, and it's like
things get worse.
it gets better.
Well, it gets better. Well, it gets worse, then it gets better.
Gets worse, better than in between. So I can understand a lot of things. So
Thank you so much.
So I have a question, but
Yeah.
it might be better answered later after your mom talks.
Go
But
for it.
As a parent
Okay.
who put a child on meds as a teenager, who is now an adult and advocates for herself, I mean, has for a long time medically, advocates for herself. How do you, as a parent, have the conversation with the child, or, you know, the adult child, of how important this work is and the potential of getting off the drugs?
I agree. I think we'll wait and let either my mom answer that or maybe it will get answered in our conversation because
Great.
I am not a parent, so I'm not going to assume that I have any clue how to do that.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate it.
I just wanted to say that as a child at 11 in an institution with Thorazine and chlorohydrate and all that other stuff, when I listened to you talk, I got the chills. Because so many of those things happened to me. And I couldn't figure out why I was having so much mood trouble. And so I just wanted to say that and why didn't anybody come up with this before? Why didn't anybody look at that and say, well, no wonder their mood is changing. No wonder they're acting out. No wonder there's a reason for all of this. And yet you blame the patient over and over again for things that oftentimes they couldn't help.
Yeah.
So I also want to thank you.
You're welcome. I'm sorry that happened to you.
Yeah.
Now, it's one of the only medical specialties where we consistently blame the patient for an illness that we're also told is not their fault. It's baffling.
Any more? We're about ready for our 10-minute break before Brooke's mom and her have this, I think, real powerful conversation. So last chance. All right, let's take 10 minutes. Again, books are there, restrooms right across the hall, and then we've got a few tables. If you have time, please look at what's on those. See you in 10.
Okay, we'll get started in about 2 minutes.
You see the, all right, everybody, if you can try to get back to your seats. We're getting ready for our next session with Brooke and Dee, and our own Dr. Ashley Ackerman will be doing the intro for them, and then we'll invite them up to the table.
Okay, so I just first want to say thank you all so much for coming. It's good to see you all today. My name is Ashley Ackerman. I'm the Director of Programs, Training, and Education at the Mental Health and Recovery Board of Ashland County. And I get to introduce this next session, which is really exciting. Brooke Seam is an award-winning chef, writer, and speaker. After spending half of her life on antidepressant medications, she chose to discontinue their use, embarking on a journey that led to her memoir, May Cause Side Effects, which chronicles her experiences with antidepressant withdrawal. Brooke's mother, Dee Barbish, joins Brooke for our next presentation. Dee was a successful business owner in the financial industry for many years, but felt a deeper calling to help people heal. Following the sudden death of her husband, Dee sought help for her then 15-year-old daughter, which ultimately led to her being prescribed psychiatric medications. This experience profoundly impacted both of their lives. We're grateful to both of them today for joining us. Please give a warm welcome to Brooke Seam and Dee Barbish.
Thank you. See our faces. Okay, can you hear me? Can you hear you?
Can you hear me? Okay.
All right, everyone. Well, thank you again. This is a far less planned part of this event, and the reason why David found us was because I have been hosting podcasts and interviews for a website called Mad in America, which is really great. They're a science and journalism focused website that is uncovering a lot more of what I've been talking about. They do a lot more, critical work on the topic. And I thought it would be really interesting to interview my mom for it because we have had so many private conversations about everything I went through and what was happening at the time when I was medicated. So I realized that this was an angle of the conversation that isn't talked about too much and that probably we could help a lot of families and parents if we discussed it a little bit. So I think I'm ultimately want to answer the question that I don't know where she is, asked, yeah, there she is, asked, but I want to start with, now that, you guys have all heard my story, I would love for my mom to tell a little bit about what was going on from your perspective at the time. Let's start with when I was medicated.
Okay. Well, the situation was,
No, it stays.
okay, I'll lean forward a little bit. The situation was that I was 47 and Brooke was 15 in 2001 when my husband, her dad, suddenly died. We literally had probably 2 or 3 days of knowing that he was going to die before he passed. And so it was a real shock, obviously, to us. And Brooke is an only child. So in the space of less than a week, we went from a family of 3 to a family of 2. And at that time, of course, I was in shock. We were both in shock. And within a year after that time, I started to notice some things that were really concerning to me about her behavior. Now, obviously, I expected her to be grieving, and I expected to see some differences, but particularly, I noticed some things in her behavior that were really scary to me, and I also thought that she was developing an eating disorder. So
Which I was, but I was also a very serious ballet dancer, so there's some context there.
So from my standpoint, I think I had a lot of anxiety around that. You could say maybe that I even overreacted. And the person that I used to talk to about this situation was gone, So I was a single mother and worried that I was going to lose the one remaining member of my family. And so what I did is I turned to 2 of my friends. One is a marriage and family counselor. The other one had a master's degree in psychology. And they both advised me to put Brooke in counseling. So they both recommended a particular child psychologist in our hometown, and I sent her there. Unbeknownst to me, she hated the psychologist right from the get-go and wasn't talking to the woman. But I had no idea that that was happening. I was taking her faithfully once a week or whatever it was. I would ask her how it was. I wouldn't get a response. She was 15. She wasn't really talking to her mom. And I had to just rely on the fact that this psychologist was hopefully helping her. But about 6 months after this treatment began, I took a phone call from the psychologist, and she said, Dee, I can't tell you what's happening in the session because of HIPAA laws, but I want you to know that you're wasting your money. I'm diagnosing Brooke with an anxiety and depressive disorder, and you need to take her to a psychiatrist. And that was literally the only information that I had on what was going on, and that's the reason Brooke was taken to a psychiatrist. No other information.
Do you remember if you were in the room with me with that first psychiatrist?
I don't remember. I can't remember.
I don't remember either, but I don't think you were. So a little background on the first psychiatrist is I was put...
psychologist?
No, on the psychiatrist. I was put on 2 other drugs before we landed on the combination of Effexor XR and Wellbutrin XL. And at the time, the only 2 drugs that were approved for use in children and teens were Prozac and Zoloft. I think what happened is that I specifically remember having negative, pretty obvious side effects very quickly, which also should have been a signal. This is something I didn't mention, but if people typically get on a psychiatric drugs and they do worse or they have side effects that come on quickly, that's usually a sign that their bodies aren't going to respond well physiologically to these drugs. Unfortunately, what we do is just pop people around on different ones, as opposed to realizing like, oh, maybe this is not a product market fit. But I was on Prozac, I think, and Zoloft, and I had bad side effects to both of them. So then we ultimately ended up on Effexor and Wellbutrin, which didn't create the immediate side effects. But so that means there was probably 3 separate meetings. I imagine you had to have been at one of them, or at least been in the waiting room.
You know, I could have been. I just don't remember. What I remember was that after the first drugs, she was either sleeping all the time, falling asleep in school. She was in high school at the time, or, you know, I think you had some nausea. some
Yeah, one of them
dizzy-
made my heart race like crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so they just kept switching her around to a different drug. Yeah.
I had someone ask me right after I spoke just now if I did better in the short term, like when I first took the drugs, if the depression or any of those issues, the eating disorder went away, or if it was helped. And my response was that I don't have a ton of memory around that time, and everything's pretty fuzzy. And so from your perspective, did they help?
I think this is the question of the day, and I think it's the most important thing that you could take away from our conversation. And I don't think that it helped Brooke. I think she was the same. But I felt, and this makes me really emotional because I felt supported. I felt like I had somebody in my corner, whether it was the psychologist or the psychiatrist. I was doing something to help my child. I was taking an action, and I was having this person with an MD behind his name telling me it was the right thing. And I didn't have anybody to talk to at that time, right? So for me, I felt better. Whether it helped her, I think, is really questionable. I think she was the same. She might have been more dull. She might have been less, fewer ups and downs, maybe more subdued. Maybe I thought that was better because I didn't have to deal with her ups and downs. And when you consider that we've always been really close, and for any of you who's a mother, you're going to get this. When your child is up, you're up. When your child is down, you're down. So for me, oh yeah, these drugs helped. For her, I'm not so sure.
I've never asked this question before, but did anyone try and get you to go on antidepressants?
No, because you were the problem, honey.
I do like the spotlight. Okay, so let's kind of move through time here. So we've got about 15 years. I was medicated at 15. The eating disorder did not get better. That definitely got worse. I think ultimately the depression definitely got worse. For me, I created an identity around it. It was very convenient because not only had my dad died, but then I got told that I had a chemical imbalance. So it was very easy for me to just attribute every bad thing that happened to me to the fact that it wasn't my fault. I didn't have to do anything about it. And if I didn't thrive, I had, my ceiling was low. This is kind of how I mentally thought about it. And that worked until it didn't. But when we hit 30, so I had moved to New York City, I was working in kitchens. And what did you recognize in those 15 years? Did you notice a progression?
Yes, I mean, she wasn't getting better at all. She was getting worse and worse. She was lifeless. She was unmotivated. She was immovable. She was depressed. She didn't care about anything. She wasn't the kid I carried or the kid I knew. And so I started, of course, a few years in, when I had healed enough and I had maybe stabilized enough, I started to notice this more. But I kept waiting for her to launch, so to speak. She's in her early 20s. She's maybe her late teens, early 20s. She went to a good college, but she just wasn't really functioning in the way that I felt that she should, and I thought it was the drugs.
Yeah, it was really like I couldn't meet my potential. I think I had
Not even
everything
close.
I
Not even
needed.
close.
Yeah, and there was a clear difference. I mean, to show the staunch difference. Before my dad died, I was on a math and engineering track. I had won a math award at some point. I loved building things. I was playing around with programming back with a dial-up internet in 1999. You know, I was really interested in all of that, and my dad loved to build things, and it was something we did together. And then when he died, it's like all of that stopped. It completely stopped. I stopped. I'm not saying I ever really cared about that stuff before. It was just the natural progression took a different turn. We really pivoted, and the next thing you know, I'm at this like bougie East Coast liberal arts school, futzing around in philosophy majors and history majors, and never took another math or science course ever again. And then I graduated and went to culinary school and made $7 an hour in kitchens for most of my Manhattan career. It just didn't make sense based on where we were, where we started, and then where we ended up. Do you remember, going towards the question that was asked, do you remember when you started suggesting that to me that this was the drugs, and how did that go?
I think I first brought that up to you when you were in college.
Really?
Yeah, but it didn't go well.
Didn't land.
No, I mean, she was medicated in Reno for about 2 years before she went away to college. And when she went away to college, then she became in charge of her own medical decisions. Everything. She was going to see a psychiatrist at college.
Roughly once a year, just to get
was-
the drugs.
I was completely out of control. And, I had no input of any kind. I had nothing to say about it. And you've always been the kind of person who's going to run your own life. That part never changed from the time she was a little kid all the way through. She was always very determined to run her own life. And so when I brought that up to you, you put me soundly in my place.
Yeah, that makes sense. I was under such an impression that that she didn't understand that this was a disease, it was an illness, I had no control over it. And I also was under the impression that if I feel this depressed on these drugs, it's gonna be worse when I get off of them. I mean, it's in the name, right? It's called an antidepressant. Turns out that's a very clever marketing trick, but I very much bought into that, and so there was no moving me. But then you kept talking about it, and as I got a little older, like in my late 20s,
I kept talking about it because of the experiences that I had with you. So at the time I was living in Nevada, she was living in New York City, and I would see her maybe 3 or 4 times a year. But I would talk to her on the phone every single night. That was our agreement. And I would hear when I talked to her on the phone this dullness in her voice, this lack of life, so I knew how she was. And then when I would see her, when she would come home, or I would go to New York, she would just be lying on the couch, just completely unmotivated, wanting to do nothing, just getting more and more depressed, and I got more and more concerned. And this episode is actually recounted in her book, that she came home one time to Reno and crawled into bed with me, and she told me, there's something really wrong with me. I'll never be right. I was born this way. I'm hopeless. And I said, no, that's not true. This isn't the kid I carried. No, you're not right. It's these drugs. And she got up out of the bed, very angry, and said, told me that I didn't know what I was talking about, and stalked out of the room.
Mm-hmm. Do you remember roughly how long did it take me to then call you and say, I'm thinking of getting off of these drugs? A couple of years?
Oh, at
1 to 2
least.
years?
At least. It had to have been 3 or 4 years after that episode,
Yeah.
I think. And that was only because of traveling around the world.
Yeah, that was really the prompt for this. I don't think had that happened, because I had a logistical problem. I literally could not get a year's worth of supply of these drugs and carry them with me. And so I also had assumed, it kind of dawned on me that I didn't wear the same clothes as I did when I was 15. Like, why am I on the same set of drugs? Like, shouldn't my brain, shouldn't someone have adjusted for that? I didn't know anything about this at the time, so I thought that there must have been some major scientific leap in antidepressants, and that all I had to do was, swap out the 2 I was on for the one that worked better, and that was it. But do you remember when I floated the idea that I was gonna switch all this up on you. I don't really remember that conversation.
Well, you called me from New York and you had decided to go on this trip around the world. And you explained the logistical problems. And you told me that you were going to go to a new psychiatrist and try to come off. And I was 100% in favor of that. You know, I certainly wasn't going to argue with you. Mm-hmm. There was no point in arguing with you about anything. So I said I'd support that.
So that was I got off I went to see the psychiatrist in early March. What do you remember? When did I don't remember. I think, and there's so much memory loss around this stuff, and like we talked every day because I would walk my dog around the block, and so it was this routine. Sometimes that stuff gets blended together, but I know that it was only about 6 days after being off the Effexor that the really terrifying withdrawal symptoms set in. What I don't remember is how much I was telling you and what you knew and what you were witnessing from the other side of the country on the phone.
Well, we talked every day, right? So I knew when you had come off the Effexor. Mm-hmm. And I also had witnessed this once before because there was one time when she came to Reno and there was a problem with her prescription. She couldn't get it filled or something and she had run out. And she had some very strong reactions in Reno just until she could get that prescription refilled. So I knew that this could be a little bit rocky, but not in the way that it ultimately unfolded. So I was just encouraging her and supporting her and kind of not trying to weigh in too heavily one way or the other. And then you called me when you saw the street light and everything changed. Mm-hmm. She called to report that she had been walking on the street in New York and all of a sudden everything changed. The world looked different.
Yeah. And I really, when I say it looked different, I mean, it was like, I said it in my talk, it was like the cotton or whatever was around me had been pulled off all at once. So quite literally the light changed, like it went from, I know sometimes people will see kind of halos around lights. It was dusk. And so everything went from a halo to me, which was normal, to a star. And then all of a sudden it was like I took earplugs out and everything got so much louder, like everything was louder. And my smell perked up and then my skin all of a sudden became super sensitive. It started to rain and I could feel the raindrops hitting my arms, but it hurt. It literally, my skin became so sensitive. And this happened in quite literally a second, all at once, that it felt like little BBs hitting my arm. It was that painful. And that was the moment when I realized, and color got more intense too. And that was the moment when I realized that these drugs had had a deep effect on every way I was experiencing the world, not just on my mood. And that was kind of cool. Then it got really scary.
And then she started to have really violent visions.
I'd call them more like intrusive thoughts. It wasn't like a hallucinogenic vision. It was almost like there was a screen over my eyes where I could see the world as it was around me, but it's almost like I'd see out scenarios that could play with the people who I was seeing. And they were violent and very scary.
And so she called me one night, and I will never forget this, and she told me, I'm having these violent, horrific thoughts. She didn't want to tell me specifically what she was experiencing. I've since read it in her book. It's very graphic. But I had a strong visceral reaction to what she was saying. I knew intuitively how bad it was. And she was saying, this is me without the drugs. You know, I'm dangerous. And I can't be without these drugs. And there was this real feeling of fear and panic and desperation. And that's when I said, you need to call, and I named a friend of mine. I said, you need to call Kathy. I called my friend and I said, Brooke's gonna call you, you need to take the call. And I think it was Kathy that kind of got you through that moment, wasn't it?
Yeah, so what happens, and I hear this a lot from people, is that when the psychological intrusive thoughts, the psychological and emotional side effects can be almost the hardest part of withdrawal. The only physical side effect that I really hear people say is worse than the emotional one is akathisia, which is why I brought it up to you guys earlier. But that's the side effect that we're in the real severe world at that point. I didn't have akathisia like the woman in the video. I don't know if I even had it at all, honestly. I don't know. I didn't know there was a name for it, so if I was just kind of restless and twitchy, I just thought I was restless and twitchy. So I really don't know, but I don't really identify with having that. But the cognitive and the psychological and emotional side effects, on the other hand, when you've been on a psychiatric drug for your entire adult life and you're used to dealing with people who view you through the lens of being, a psychiatric patient in any way, whether or not that's you're getting your drugs from a GP or you're in an institution, and something happens, you're very attuned to when you start going a little iffy psychologically because you think, oh my God, they're right. And so I get off these drugs, I start having these really horrific visions and emotional reactions to it, and the only thing I could think of is, obviously, I need these drugs. If this is me without them, I'm not even safe. Now, never mind the fact that this had never happened to me once in my life. Not as a kid, not when I was unmedicated, not while I was on the drugs, right? This was a sudden onset, which if I had taken these side effects to a psychiatrist at that moment, she would have said that I was a danger to myself and other people and put me on an involuntary psychiatric hold. When in reality, I was having a withdrawal reaction to the lowest dose on the market of a common antidepressant that she told me was safe. Okay? This is happening all the time to people, right? And so it's not safe to talk about. You can't go up to someone, didn't even feel safe. I felt shame around it, so much shame around the idea that I would ever think of hurting someone. And I didn't care about myself. I could think about hurting myself and admit that all day long, but I was not okay with potentially hurting somebody else or even thinking about it. So I had so much shame around telling anyone. And even if there was someone who I thought was safe, there really is no safe person in that unless you're talking to someone who's been through it. So I knew intuitively that I shouldn't go back to my psychiatrist. But when you said to call Kathy, literally the math I did in my head was, she's in a different state. She can't commit me. The fact that I had to think about that before I reached out for help is insane. Actually insane, not the insane I thought I was. But she just pointed out to me that she was a psychologist, not a prescriber, but she said, I think that, these are powerful drugs and that this is part of the withdrawal process. And that framework helped. It was the first time it had been suggested to me that this was even possible. And I think I did a little bit of Googling at that point, found a couple of these support groups. The main one at the time is called Surviving Antidepressants, it still exists. And I think I just saw people having way more extreme reactions on there than I had been told. But what I said to myself was okay, there's something about this that is getting off the Effexor. But I had the sense not to go digging around on that website too much. I was I don't need to be digging around in other people's pain. This is bad enough. And so I got off the internet, which was smart. But I also still had the ignorance thinking that this was only going to last a few weeks. I think if you had told me in that moment that this was going to be a 2-year-long process, I don't know if I would have continued.
It was, and then it was accompanied by amazing rages that, thank God, weren't directed at others, but she did completely bend and dismember an ironing board, which shows how much rage she had. She's small, but she completely bent an ironing board in half. Yeah. And I can say that one of the things that helped me through this, quite honestly, is that I did not live with her. I talked to her every day, but there was enough distance that I didn't have to be there 24/7 really watching it. And I know now, because I work with so many people that are in withdrawal, that it's extremely hard on the caregivers. It's extremely hard on the parents or the husband or you know, whoever it is that has to deal with that, living with that person, it's an incredible challenge. And I think that that's one of the areas where I think we need a lot more education for these caregivers, because they don't know what they're seeing either. And
I think that psychiatric drug withdrawal or psychiatric side effects, because we talk about this a lot in the context of people getting off their drugs entirely, but this is also a conversation that happens when people change a drug or when they just step down, right? And sometimes you have to. Sometimes you have to change a drug for some reason, or you know, whatever's going on, or sometimes it's not even a choice. Like if you get sick and you end up in the hospital, like you're not going to be there to take your Effexor in the morning, and then suddenly there's a problem. And so the problem, the reason why this is so tricky, and it's an angle of this that's really misunderstood, and it's part of why that discussion around the heroin with RFK was so frustrating to so many people in the community. It's because when it comes to...
could I interrupt you for a second? Because I didn't realize, you didn't realize it, but you misspoke that.
What did I do?
And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think what RFK said was that withdrawal from a psychiatric med can be more difficult than withdrawal from heroin. Is that correct?
Well, he said he had family members specifically who had a harder time getting off.
Yes, and you misspoke.
Maybe I did, but the point is that for heroin withdrawal, for alcohol withdrawal, for nicotine withdrawal, even like opioid withdrawal, we know what that looks like, right? We know how to detox someone off of some of these street drugs. We know what alcohol withdrawal looks like. We know that people can die from those things. We also know they're temporary. Like if you put someone in a room without alcohol and detox them and you do it safely, they're gonna get through that, and it's gonna last, you know, a couple of days, maybe a couple of weeks. There is no one who's been in alcohol withdrawal for 10 years. There's no one who's been in heroin withdrawal for 10 years. And there are people who have been in psychiatric withdrawal for 10 years. And so you hit a point with this where the caregiver expects there to be just a few weeks of this, but then it keeps going, and there's no playbook for this. There's no type of Alcoholic Anonymous group. There's no NNA group. There's no meetings for this. But there's so many people, again, 1 in 4 people are gonna have severe withdrawal if they try and come off of these drugs. That's hundreds of thousands of people around this world, and everyone is just independently trying to figure this out themselves. I know I'm really glad I didn't live with you too. But, you know, it's interesting now because I've had the flip side experience here where I talk all the time about, and it's in my book, where people in withdrawal, protracted withdrawal like I was, they need a lifeline. They need someone who's going to pick up that phone every single time they call. But that is one hell of a burden to put on somebody else. And I think that I had my mother, and we were so bonded from the experience we went through that I knew if I called, she would pick up. But now we both deal with people who don't have this relationship with their mother. They don't have someone who has that unconditional love for them. I have been put in the position now of being that person for somebody else, and it's exhausting. Like I've done this from both sides, and I've been through it. And I'm still supporting that person. It's been almost a year, and he's doing a lot better, but I have now picked up the phone and been on the phone for 4 hours with someone. And so there's the caregivers, we need a lot there too.
And it's doubly confusing because it's like what Brooke was talking about protracted withdrawal or delayed onset withdrawal, because you might think that your family member's just doing fine after they came off their Effexor. And you know, I have a client like this who came off Effexor in September and everything was really fine till March. And then all of a sudden it just hit like gangbusters. So if you're the husband or the wife of that person, how confounding.
Yeah. Now, you and I are lucky in the sense that, you know, when my dad died, we probably could have gone in 2 directions. We could have either bonded further or gone separately, and we bonded further. And so that has created this unbelievable level of openness. And it's why we're here talking. And it's, I think it's important for everyone here to know that I don't have any resentment over what happened. But I think the reason why I don't have the resentment is because our relationship has been strong enough to work through it.
And also, you're adult enough to recognize that what I did, I thought I was doing the right thing. And I was being told by all these people with fancy degrees that I was doing the right thing. And I wasn't in this situation, but I know a lot of parents are. If you don't do what this doctor says, you're accused of not doing the right thing for your child. You might even get, in some cases, reported to social services because you denied your child this particular help.
Yeah.
So, you never blamed me for that. I really appreciate it. I've forgiven myself because I did the best I could at the time. But, it's still very hard for me to hear all the suffering she went through because of that decision.
How would you help a parent who wants to have a conversation about this with their kid? Maybe their kid's medicated and in charge of their own medical stuff like I was.
And the child is an adult now?
Yeah, and wants to run their own life.
I really think that in this kind of situation, the adult child does have to run their own life. You can weigh in, you can give information, but ultimately I think you probably are going to have to accept your child's decision and support them if they decide to change their mind. Just, tell them that you'll support whatever decision it is, but it is their decision. Even if you disagree with it. That's my opinion. I've been there lots of times with you. The whole time you didn't want to get off the meds.
Yeah.
I just had to support you. I kept trying to support whatever she needed. I didn't have a choice at that point.
In your work with families, is there anything in particular that you notice seems to help the caregivers or help the situation more than something else? Is there something that sticks out?
Yeah, information, and also lots of times the real key is for the caregiver to get support for himself or herself. If I had done that when Brooke was 15, if I had put myself in therapy instead of putting her in therapy, this whole thing would have gone a different way, because so often we identify the child as the problem because the child has some sort of behavior that's really hard for us to deal with or hard for us to watch or something we're ashamed of, or other people in our lives are saying, that child shouldn't be doing this or that, or the child's giving the teacher a hard time in school, whatever it is. And so often we medicate a child for our own convenience, to make our own life easier, when it really isn't for the child at all. It's for us. And so if I had put myself in therapy and gotten some support in a different way, we could have probably avoided this. So that's what I would say to every parent. Before you decide that you're going to medicate your child, see what you can do with yourself about your own reaction to that child. What is it about what the child is doing that's so bothersome to you? And what can you do to help yourself change your own attitude toward that, reframe that, work with that for yourself before you medicate the child? Medication should be the last resort. We don't know what this causes. As Brooke pointed out, there's no research on this. We don't know what this causes with developing brains. There's a little boy that I have become acquainted with lately, only about 10 years old, and he is on the lower end of the autism spectrum, or he's been diagnosed autistic. He's mostly nonverbal, but not completely nonverbal. But they decided to, at the insistence of his teacher, they decided to medicate him for ADHD as well. And they put him, I think, on Adderall and high blood pressure medication, because the side effect of Adderall is high blood pressure. So we've got this 7 or 8-year-old on, 2 meds, and he's fairly nonverbal, but whenever he has to take the medication, he cries. Why? It's not to help the child, it's to help the teacher. The other thing that I would say is that if a child is exhibiting some kind of behavior that is really unwanted, we need to get to the bottom of why that behavior is happening. And I'll give you another example from my own practice, where there was a 9-year-old little girl who was in foster care for having been abandoned twice by her biological mother, who was an addict. And so the foster mother came to me and said, the teacher, the school, the pediatrician, the child psychologist, they're all saying I need to medicate this child for ADHD. She isn't doing well in school. She's being disruptive in school. She is, sharpening her pencil during the Pledge of Allegiance. She's doing these various things that are disruptive. And the mother was Hispanic. The foster mother was Hispanic. And she said, in our culture, we just don't medicate kids. She said, this doesn't seem right to me, but it was the mother against everybody else. And I said, absolutely not. I agree with you. I gave her information. The child wasn't medicated. Well, several months later, the mother asked me to go to court with them because she was going to formally adopt the child. And so I was, very blessed to be able to go to court and see that adoption. And from the time that child was adopted, all her problems in school disappeared. She no longer needs ADHD medication. So that's a really obvious example, but it happens all the time. If the child can't separate from mommy, and the child should at that age separate from mommy, why not? What's going on? What happened to that child that made the child react this way? Instead of going directly to medication, ask the questions. Dig down. That's what I would say to parents.
How are we on time, David? Sure, yeah, no, we can go, unless is there anything else that you and I do you have any questions for me that you think I should ask you?
No, I guess we could take questions. I'm not thinking of anything.
Okay, well, I will so when my mom gives, are you good, just in case, so basically when I came off my psych drugs, part of the reason why I ended up healing was because my mother had heard of someone, I call him kind of a spiritual counselor. He was definitely a counselor, but it was with a modality that I had never heard of before called Compassion Key. And it spoke to me. Part of the reason why it spoke to me is because it was able to be done over the phone. And so this was before all therapy went on Zoom, and there was no video here, and that's part of the point. And so when I was in withdrawal, everything was so difficult for me. Like, the idea of getting on the subway to go to a therapist's office, to sit in the therapist, to be told halfway through that time's up, then have to get myself back on the subway and get home when I couldn't even keep it together in public anyway, right? Because so much of my symptoms were, they were exacerbated by people's faces. It was like a trigger for me. And I lived in New York, so that was kind of a problem. So the fact that I could just get on the phone with this man and have my therapy using this modality, and the fact that it was actually helpful was super important. And so you had realized as I was going through this that this was part of what you wanted to do a little bit. And so I'm just bragging a little bit now, but she now works with people in her private practice with this modality and a few other ones. And so she actually, she told me a couple years ago when I would sort of pass people to her, she says, I like the complicated cases. And so her perspective on this is really interesting because we talk about all the time. Like the other day, she said to me, you know, the more I work with people like this, the more I realize how lucky you were.
Yes. Yeah, I think that I'm really glad you brought that up because Brooke suffered for 2 years, but she was in a situation when she was traveling around the world where she had to fend for herself. She had to get herself to the grocery store or to the airport on time or checked into her hotel room or whatever it was. She had to. Whereas a lot of the people I work with now are completely dependent on their parents or their husband or whatever it is. They can't get out of bed. They can't take a shower. They can't cook for themselves. They certainly can't work. The amount of agony that they're suffering because they're tapering off these drugs that has made them so hypersensitive. Brooke was complaining about not liking the feeling of clothing on her body. So imagine that level of sensitivity. I have a client right now who has to wear noise muffling headphones all the time, can't stand to have clothes on her body, can't stand the smell of anything. And what she needs from me is just keep going, you're gonna make this will end. That's really all I can give her. Because it's just because her only way out, she can't tolerate the medication. That's what's causing this in her body. The side effects were so bad she had to stop.
Yeah, I want to make that point because I think there's a natural question comes up here is, well, I'm never going to get off these drugs. Why would I do that? If this is what's going to happen, and there's a couple things. One, that we are talking about the more severe end of that bell curve, the folks my mom works with. The reason why I wanted to bring that up is because she has a very unique perspective of dealing with some of the more extreme cases. And so the modality she uses and her perspective on it is in dealing with big crisis cases, right? Most people aren't going to be that. They might be some level of that, or maybe they have a severity for a short period of time. Shoot, what was I gonna say?
You were saying, why would you want to get off the drug?
Right. So some people don't. Some people just don't want to. That's fine. Like, you do you, right? Whatever you want. If it's working for you, keep going. But what we also see happen a lot is that once people end up on these drugs for a longer period of time, we're talking 5+ years, really going into like your 10 years and so on, is the body starts breaking down. And so that balance of the perceived benefit of them and the side effects starts to shift. And we don't know why. I mean, I think that there's a level of the body just being like, yeah, we're done trying to make this work, and so we're going to rebel. But you get to a point where people are kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't. They're stuck on the drugs. They can't figure out how to get off them, but they're making them sicker as they stay on them. So this is why we have this problem, and why somebody asked me about short-term use. And it's like, our research is short-term use. It's 4 to 12 weeks, right? So if you've been on them for short-term, then all of this may be highly irrelevant. But sometimes I'll say to people, well, come back to me in 5 years, come back to me in 10, right? We're gonna have a different conversation. So this process changes. This isn't necessarily a conversation or education on these drugs are bad all the time, they should never be used. It's saying that we are using them inappropriately. We are using them in ways that they have never been designed to be used or been studying. And now we're starting to see huge socio-cultural effects because of that. And we don't know how to pull people off. So that's the point.
Yes, thanks for reeling me in, because it is true that I'm talking about like worst case scenario. And if you are on one of these drugs, it doesn't mean that this is going to happen to you if you want.
Yeah.
Because you could be in the 50% of people who can come off fairly easily, right? Yeah. And even if you're not, half of those people who are left only have a more mild withdrawal. So I apologize if I've scared the hell out of anyone. It can be very bad, but it doesn't have to be. And also, in my really bad cases, usually the reason that they got in this situation is because they decided to cold turkey, or they came off way, way, way too fast. So if we can slow it down and really do it much more gradually, a lot of this can be avoided. But at the same point, and I guess this is something that's really important, like if you're taking care of somebody who's on one of these drugs and for some reason they have to go into the ER, for instance, it's really important that these doctors know what they're on and don't just all of a sudden pull them off of whatever psych med they're on. Can cause really big problems.
Can we thank them? And we do have some time for some questions. I'm sure there's a few questions that are rumbling around. Come on up here to the mic and ask Dee and or Brooke. Thank you, Carly. Celebrity.
Not a celebrity. So just a couple of thoughts and then a question at the end. To put things in perspective, I'm a clinician, I'm a therapist, but also I'm a social work professor here, so I teach people how to diagnose. And I guess I'm just really disheartened by some of the stories you've told about people and how they've responded to some of these situations. Like when I hear, I know for us, when I'm teaching students how to diagnose, we teach, first of all, rule out any physical underlying issues that may be causing some mental health-like symptoms. But then the other thing is looking at impact of something. So let's say somebody goes on a new medication, you're saying they just either up the medication if they don't feel well or they're having side effects. And I think that's not what we teach. We teach people to listen to that. If I haven't had a symptom before, why would I attribute that to a mental illness versus the addition of a medication, right? So and then the child with the ADHD and the trauma, the ADHD symptoms went away because the trauma was addressed. We know those two have very similar presentations. So I'm wondering how can we better, I feel like I'm doing my part in my little side of the world, but how do we better educate people who are doing diagnosing to really listen to some of these things with people with medication? Personally and professionally, I'm not anti or pro. I think people should make their own choices about medication, but just being very educated on listening to people, how do we get that word out or better educate people so that we don't just kind of dismiss or misdiagnose? Does that make sense?
Can I ask a question? When you're teaching, what are those kids, how old are the people?
Well, we typically have traditional students here. So by the time they get to my class junior year, 19 to 22.
Okay. And they're studying to be social workers or ultimately clinicians?
Well, so social workers are part of the social work field. A large part are clinicians. So the behavioral health workforce is made up of more than 50% social workers. So some of them will go directly into being clinicians and potentially diagnosing. Other ones will go into different areas that most people are more aware of, like child welfare and other things.
It's a big question, and there are a couple of things that immediately come to mind. The first one is, and I may have to dig around to find the research on this, but find the specific researcher who researches on this, but there's a phenomenon that's been studied in medical schools where medical students lose their empathy sometime in year 2. We can actually measure that. That's basically the point where we break a medical student, and the reason why they went into medicine to help people, it switches to, I just got to get through this, and people become charts. So if we think about it from a medical perspective, that's a measurable phenomenon. So by the time people get spit out of a medical system, everything that they've learned about doing this right is kind of replaced for, how do I bill? I have 15 minutes with a patient. What do I need to do in that 15 minutes? I can tell you that not a single lab was run on me in the 15 years that I was medicated, not one. It just doesn't happen. And so there's this big gap in between the theory and what we're teaching students versus what's actually happening in reality. And the reality is that we're looking at maybe 15-minute appointments, even less on telehealth now. I mean, it takes all of 5 minutes to sign up for these telehealth websites and get prescribed almost anything you want. It's just not happening. And so I don't think it's so much a failure of the early systems. Like what I'm trying to say is I don't think there's anything you can do. The problem's happening down the chain. And people just either don't have the power, they don't have the resources, or they don't have the knowledge or even know what to look for if we were to run a lab or rule out. And then who's going to pay for it? It just gets more and more complicated, I think.
Thank you.
Yeah.
What I wanted to know is while you and your mother were going through all this, did you ever consider going to a negotiator or a therapist so that both of you could look at this with a third party?
We didn't, and we should have.
I wouldn't have gone.
You wouldn't have gone?
Nope.
Yeah, that's probably true, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, at that time, she wasn't talking to me because she was a teenager,
Oh,
right?
sure.
I wouldn't have gone in my 20s either.
So you were real stubborn.
Oh, yes. Well, I mean, look, we've all had this experience, right? I'm going to take this to a political thing we all understand. If you're trying to argue with someone on the other side of the political spectrum, I don't care which side you're on, have you ever succeeded in moving them? No, right? It doesn't matter how right you are or wrong you are. It doesn't matter the facts. It doesn't, because it's an identity thing. So asking me to move my identity at a time when my whole life was revolved around this, and it was largely unconscious, is an impossible ask. I had to be the one to come to the conclusion.
Now, is there anything that might have moved you?
I mean, maybe if I had had this opportunity to travel and run into this logistical problem earlier, but I don't think so, because as I said, it was very convenient for me. I had an excuse for everything. And I liked that, and that was conscious. I knew that I was using it as an excuse, but I didn't care. It was benefiting me.
Thank you.
I don't know if this is a question or just maybe just asking for a response, but for Dee, you had mentioned when you had originally had Brooke go to a psychologist that they called you after a few sessions and said, because of HIPAA, we can't tell you anything, which is not correct. As a parent, you would have had all rights to the full chart and everything else. And then with the psychiatrist, you'd mentioned that you weren't sitting down with them the first few sessions and you weren't going over the medications they were suggesting to prescribe. Typically there's, at least where I work, there's a sign off by the parent to have the meds. So I'm just curious, during that time, did you felt disempowered or accepting kind of what the people said? I'm just curious, going forward, did you get more informed consent? And then what would you advise parents now?
Wait, one second. I believe this is largely state dependent. And so I've looked into this.
HIPAA's a federal law.
Well, HIPAA's a federal law, but the interpretation of it and what a clinician, like, I think in the state of Nevada, unless there's obvious, known, like active harm, the clinician can make the choice to protect someone older. I believe in Nevada, but it's obviously gray.
I don't have a strong recollection exactly of whether she used the words because of HIPAA. I can't tell you. However, she clearly said, I cannot tell you what's happening in these sessions, but you're wasting your money, and I'm diagnosing Brooke with an anxiety and depressive disorder, because I can remember the shock. I can remember where I was standing with holding the phone. That was one of those moments, like we all remember where we were when, President Kennedy was shot or whatever. For me, that was one of those moments where I can remember where I was standing and I can remember her words. I'm diagnosing Brooke with an anxiety and depressive disorder, and you are wasting your money with me, and you need to take her to a psychiatrist, and this is who I'm sending you to.
Basically saying therapy couldn't have helped with any of that.
Absolutely, like you're wasting your money. She's got this psychiatric disorder, and you need to move her on. And I knew that asking her questions was not going to give me an answer. So whether that's the same now as it was in 2002, I don't know. But that's the way it was at that time.
My other question is for Brooke, and if you don't have to answer it if you don't want to, but you obviously were on a cocktail of medications, and maybe if you saw different clinicians, often it seems like you get a different diagnosis. If you go to another person, something else gets changed or added. At any point where you also added an ADHD diagnosis?
No, I was not. I admit I have had a colossally bad luck in doctors. So I sought out the type of doctor that wouldn't ask questions. So I got given these set of drugs. Once I was on all 6 of them, I would just go, whenever I moved states or needed to get a new clinician, I'd walk into the office, I'd say, this is what I've been on. I've been on it for this long. I don't want to change anything. I don't want anything new. Basically, I'm just here to have you write me a script. And I have 2 quick anecdotes about how bad this was. The first time is when I moved to New York City. I said, I'm going to be smart about this and go see a psychiatrist. Like, I was doing what I thought I was supposed to do. So I found a psychiatrist who was in my insurance, and she sat me down. An assistant sat me down in a room with a videotape, and I watched a 45-minute videotape with a survey that said, it had like a little guy talking and said, like, have you ever felt more out of control than normal? Sometimes, occasionally, very often, never. It was a 45-minute thing that I had to go and circle this thing. Once that was done, a videotape, I took it to her, she looked at it, and basically, turns out she was a specialist in bipolar, but this is how she diagnosed. And she said, this is a little concerning, we should keep an eye on it. Like, I don't want to do anything right now, but we're going to come back and we're going to reevaluate. That was 5 minutes after I watched a videotape in New York City, and this woman was written up as one of the best psychiatrists in Manhattan. Even I knew that was total bull at that point, and so I backed out. Instead, I found a GP who was around the corner. I walked in, I said, I'm on these 6 drugs, I don't want to change anything, I just want to continue it. He said, are you happy with it? I said, yes. And then 4 years later, he called me and he said, I just realized we never did a physical, we should probably do that.
And one thing I think it's important to note is that she wasn't on 6 psychiatric meds. She was on 2 psychiatric meds, but the other 4 drugs she had to add to manage the side effects of the 2 psychiatric meds.
And nobody questioned that.
So the psychiatric med made her thyroid go crazy, so she had to be on a thyroid med.
But nobody ever tested me after it was tested when I was 16 or whatever it was. We never had another thyroid test again.
And then when she got completely off her 2 psychiatric meds, all of her thyroid magically righted itself.
Yeah.
So now she isn't on any of those meds.
Thank you for your transparency.
Yeah.
Brooke, this is directed directly at you. The social impact, you talk about what it did to you personally, about your family, about the doctors. What about the employees that you had as a chef? What about the kids in school? How did they react as you're coming off and your personality changes? Were they supportive? Or were they non-supportive? What was the deal?
This is probably a better question for my ex-business partner. Which probably answers your question. So my strategy during this was to isolate as much as possible, because I did sort of have the luxury to do that. I owned a bakery in New York at that point, co-owned it. My business partner and I had not gotten along for many years before that, and so we strategically avoided each other. And so I was usually alone in my bakery. I owned a cupcake shop, and I can promise that people would come in and expect like a perky thing wearing pink. And I would just be more like, you want a cupcake or not? Like, get out, buy it, don't care. So I don't think my my finances did not increase during this time. But for the most part, I was largely isolated. I did not tell anyone what was happening. And I just kept to myself. But as far as the larger implication, I don't think I would have made a lot of the choices I made had I not been medicated, because I'm such a radically different person. I don't like being around the people I used to be around. I don't spend time with them. I don't do the things I used to do. I don't listen to the same music. I don't eat the same food. Nothing is the same. And so I feel like I made choices as a fully different person. And if I hadn't have been medicated, I don't think I would have gotten into partnership with someone who was a bad business partner for me. And those are kind of the intangible things, right? It's like, in hindsight, I can see it, but now I look at it and it's like, oh my God, I went into business with that person. I did this job. I dated that guy. Like, what was I thinking? And the bottom line is I was thinking like a completely different person. I was not sober, but I wasn't on alcohol. Like, I was on a legal prescription drug. And that's where all the changes occurred. And that's why I say it's difficult for me now to kind of navigate some of these social situations, because so much of my life was impaired in learning all this. And now it's still like, okay, I don't know what this situation is or what it means or if it's good for me or bad for me. It's just very confusing.
Thank you very much.
I just have more comments to say. I think so much makes sense, but in mental health in general, I think is hard to understand, and we don't have a good concept of it. But I think what happens, at least with me, and it sounds like with you, it's life. Like, you have a normal life, life's going along great, and then all of a sudden you lose your father, or some horrific incident happens in your life and changes everything. Then you end up on these meds to cover up that you're dealing with. And you're worse off than what you were before that. You're more likely to want to die on these meds than what you were before that. And life just keeps hitting you one time and one time. And then you get on these medications and they change you and they just keep increasing them until you lose your mind, basically. And you don't want to be that person because you remember who you were. So I think that's just what I wanted to say is life. And as for going to see somebody, you're right. You go, they want to see you every week. It's $30 copay. You got to take off work. You get there. How are you? Well, I'm doing good. I had a pretty good week, Okay, well, next week we're going to do this, have a great day. You never get to go and address what you went there in the first place for. Mm-hmm. Not saying that that's the way it is. Mm-hmm. It just seems like experience is that way. But in my time, I came here because I am having issues with that. And I wasn't like this. I was never on meds. And yeah, I may have had ADHD, but you dealt with it and you lived with it. But being put on the medication has made things a lot worse. I'm not the person who I was, and I just want to get the happy back. And getting off the meds, you're right, it's impossible. Mm-hmm. But anyhow, I just wanted to make those comments.
Thank you. So it isn't impossible. Anyone who really wants to get off the meds, and I know I did tell the worst horror story, but not everyone suffers this much, and there are ways to do it. But I think that what you said is so important, because it's like what Brooke put up about medicating normal. It's normal in life to have ups and downs, to grieve when your father dies, or to, be upset if you have a divorce, or whatever it is, these normal ups and downs. We shouldn't be medicating normal events. We should be helping each other get through normal events. And pathologizing normal events, I think, is very harmful.
My question is, now that you are off the meds, do you still have symptoms of depression and anxiety? And if so, how do you treat them?
I mean, I was, so last year was a rough year in a lot of ways. And was it you, David, I was talking to about this? I can't remember when we did our interview, but I was on a podcast or something, and I said, I was like, look, like you could absolutely draw a circle around my symptoms right now, and I would 100% symptoms. I don't even like that word. Just around my experience right now, and say, oh yeah, I absolutely meet the definition for clinical depression right now. But the difference is that I, at no point in the last year, ever identified as a depressed person or even questioned that this was something that was wrong to a point where I needed to address it beyond, you know, using all the tools that I have gathered. And I think that that's a really key point, and it kind of ties into both of your comments, is just that it's important to look at the assumptions we have about our existence in life and society, and what is that base framework? And one of the assumptions we have at this point in time in this country is discomfort is bad. Big feelings are bad. Sensitivity is bad. That means there's something wrong. And I think it's paradoxically because of this whole anti-stigma thing and the fact that we're so afraid everyone's going to kill themselves all the time, it's like nobody has the space to even breathe. God forbid you have a thought about ending your life, the next thing you know you're suicidal and we have to take care of it. And it's just, but who hasn't had that thought at some point? Who hasn't had an intrusive thought while you're driving on the highway and think to yourself, what if I drove off? Like, I think that this is just an aspect of being human where we have, at least now, where we have so much input coming in. We are so aware of all the different things that could happen. We are not in a little tribe by ourselves where the things we have to be concerned about is whether or not there's a drought coming or where we're gonna find dinner. Like, this is complex, and we are not processing what's happening and adjusting at the speed that we're getting it. So of course we're going to have all of these different experiences, and that not all of them are going to be pleasant. And then we're teaching people that they should never be uncomfortable. I mean, even basic, like we all have air conditioning and heat in our house now. God forbid we have to be 5 or 10 degrees above or below where we want to be, right? We're all just so uncomfortable and cranky about it. We've trained it out of us. And I think that with kids especially, it's like we're so terrified they're going to fail. We're so terrified they're not going to meet our expectations that at the one instance that something happens with them, we're just trying to prevent some tragedy. Whereas, like, I was talking to someone yesterday, and it's like, well, what a radical idea it would have been if someone had come to us and say, maybe she takes her junior year off from high school. Like, what if I had taken a year off of high school to just, I don't know, work? I was a dancer, dance, like just do something different. Like, are we really gonna say that me doing that would have derailed my whole life and like meant that I was gonna be, you know, like failing? I don't know. I mean, maybe that wouldn't have been the right choice. I think that would have been difficult for us to do, but I just think we're so uncreative about how we approach this stuff. And so, no, I've never considered myself depressed ever since. Does that not mean that I've had weeks of crying and sadness and frustration or feeling anxiety? No, I've absolutely had that too, but they're different. And then as far as tools that I've used, I mean, withdrawal has a way of putting a magnifying glass on all your issues and also forcing you to get real creative and try as many things as you can to make it work and get better. So for me, like, it's really basic stuff that I've learned about myself. Like, it's very important for me in my living spaces to have windows with lights from 2 sides. Like, that's a very strange thing. I was only able to realize how much that mattered to me to have natural light in the morning from 2 sides, which means that, okay, I need to live in a place that's on a corner. But I had only figured that out when I spent 4 years in a dark apartment. And I was like, oh, this makes such a difference, right? For me, I think the diet thing is a huge component. I work with pro athletes now in the MLB and NFL, and so I see what they're doing, and then I see what most people are doing, and it's like, this isn't the same. And when I take what I do for my pro athletes and use it with people in withdrawal or who are trying to help some mental health stuff, they improve. So our food systems, I've gone through periods of meditation. It's not something I do every day, but it's certainly helped at a point. It's just the basic stuff. It's basically learning how to be less of a robot and more of a human.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I just, one part of comment, thank you both so much for being vulnerable and for being willing to share your story and your journey. I think it takes great bravery and courage to do that. And I just personally wanted to thank both of you for walking with us through that process. Secondly, I just wanted to know, Dee and Brooke, kind of what brings you life today? It's a beautiful, ending to a story, if you will, of a chapter of your story, I should say. And to see you as mother and daughter both here, enjoying life, vibrant. I just am curious, what brings you both life today?
You want to be first?
Sure. So for me, I think about this a lot, and I think about a lot of the things we get wrong about the way we start telling stories. Because if we start the story wrong, we're going to end up in the wrong place. And one of the things that I've realized is one of the biggest stories that we're really getting wrong in the world of mental health is that we think that the opposite of depression is happiness. It is not. The opposite of depression is curiosity. And being curious about how your life could be different, being curious about the different things you can experience in order to achieve this byproduct of curiosity, which is happiness or joy or contentment or connection. And so for me, the curiosity disappeared when I got on these drugs. That's why I didn't have any ambition. It wasn't just that I was flat, it's just I had no curiosity anymore. I didn't want to know what was going on in life or anybody else's life. And then as I've gotten off them and this sense of, it started off with the basic, oh my God, what happened to me? Like that was curiosity. So then I started figuring out what happened to me. And then I started getting more curious about more and more things in this world and how it works and undoing the stories I've told about myself, learning how to change my default process, because for 15 years, my excuse was no because, so I needed to switch that to yes and getting curious about why other people do the things that they're doing. Like, I may not be interested in what you're doing, but tell me why you're interested in that, right? Like, creating the flywheel of that curiosity opens the world and suddenly makes it way more interesting. So for me, I feel like I lost a lot of time that I will never get back from age 15 to 30, but I have so much to do now. There's so much to do in this world. So for me, I'm just like, I just want to do it. And I don't, I don't know if I'm going to end up in a more traditional family role. I sort of get the sense that that's not for me. And I'm kind of like, well, that's fine. There's plenty to do. I'm so curious about so many different things. And that's what, and even if it's like, even just taking a walk and literally stopping to smell the flowers is something I never used to do. And I still feel is sacred because for so long I missed that. So that's where I'm at.
For me, I would just say that you're going to experience something I really love this afternoon. I spent almost all of my professional career in the financial industry. At one time had up to 40 employees, but it never felt like exactly the right fit. I always felt like it wasn't really what I ever deep in my soul wanted to do. So when Brooke took this little journey, it gave me the opportunity to switch gears, and now being support to others and being a master compassion key practitioner, which I'm going to introduce to you guys this afternoon, is what brings me a lot of joy.
Let's thank them again for their. Dr. Ashley has told me we've gone a little over, but that's okay. We tried to account for that. So we have some time set aside. So those of you that either brought your book, Brooke's book, or need to purchase that, she's willing to sign those and have a brief discussion at the table in the back, and then we'll roll right into lunch right around noon. So we went a little over, Dr. Ashley, not too bad though. So give Brooke maybe a little bit of time to recharge, but if you would like her to sign your book, or if you still need to purchase it, you can do that. So thank you both.
I'm going to run to the restroom, but if you want to.
I also just wanted to say for the folks on Zoom, you can join the afternoon session at 12:45. Dee is going to be presenting about Compassion Key, so jump on at 12:45 on the Zoom. Thank you so much.
All right, everybody, it is 12 o'clock, and that means mushroom soup. Vicky, try to get it this year. All right, so if folks want to, it's a buffet style. If you start down here, my left, your right, where Mary's pointing. Yep, start there, and please enjoy your lunch. I think Brooke and Dee can still do some signings if you'd like, but we also want to make sure they get something to eat. I don't want anybody passing out, but please enjoy your lunch, continue these conversations. It's wonderful to hear them. Thank you.